Welcome, welcome. You're here at N.O. Harry. Today we present to you, What If Wednesday Addams Met Harry at age 8 and Their Dark Magic Created Unbreakable Sibling Bond. Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1, The Boundary. The cemetery had no name on its gate. Wednesday had noticed that immediately, the way most cemeteries announced themselves with iron letters or carved stone, as if the dead needed a mailing address. This one simply existed at the end of a dirt path off Route 9, behind a stand of black walnut trees, with a rusted gate hanging open at an angle that suggested it had given up on closing years ago. She approved of that. Pretension was exhausting. The dead didn't care what you called their neighborhood. She'd slipped away from the family picnic 40 minutes ago. Her father was reciting Poe to her mother across a checkered blanket, his voice carrying through the trees with the particular theatrical warmth he reserved for al fresco poetry. Pugsley had found an anthill and was conducting what he described as sociological experiments. Uncle Fester had fallen asleep under a tree with his mouth open, and a small bird had briefly investigated the situation before thinking better of it. Nobody had noticed Wednesday stand up, fold her napkin precisely in half, set it on her empty plate, and walk into the tree line. She'd found the path because she was looking for exactly this kind of place. A cemetery with no name meant a cemetery with no caretaker, which meant the stones would be old and the inscriptions would be honest. People stopped being honest on gravestones sometime around 1910, in her estimation. Before that, you got things like he was difficult but correct or she endured what she was given, real biographical detail. After that, everyone became beloved and at peace, regardless of the evidence. The gate creaked once when she pushed it wider and didn't creak again. The grass inside was long and seed-heavy, brushing against the hem of her dress. The stones were old enough to lean, gray-green with lichen, their carved letters softened by decades of rain. She moved between them with the careful, unhurried pace of someone visiting friends. She was reading the inscription on a 1887 stone, Matilda Voss, who answered to no one, which she thought was excellent, when she felt it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't quite a sensation either, though the closest physical comparison was the feeling of stepping from air conditioning into summer heat, that sudden awareness of a different quality of atmosphere. Something shifted in the air approximately 8 feet to her left, near the cemetery's far wall where 3 large stones had fallen against each other and created a kind of rough arch. The shift lasted perhaps 2 seconds and then settled, like a soap bubble resolving itself rather than popping. Wednesday turned and looked at the arch. Then she walked toward it, because she was 8 years old and had no fear of unusual things, only curiosity about them. She got within 4 feet and stopped. The air inside the arch of fallen stones felt different, denser, somehow, like it had more intention in it. She could see through it perfectly well. There was just more cemetery on the other side, more leaning stones, a dead apple tree, and what appeared to be a boy sitting on the ground with his back against the tree and his knees pulled to his chest. She studied him. He was small, possibly her age, possibly a year younger, though it was hard to tell because he had the compact, contained look of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. Dark hair, extremely untidy, sticking up in several directions that suggested either great effort or none at all. Glasses with a crack in the left lens, held together with what looked like a twist of copper wire. Clothes that were several sizes too large, the sleeves of a gray-green sweater rolled up twice and still hanging past his wrists. He was looking at his own hands. Not in the way people looked at their hands when they were thinking about something else. He was looking at his hands, specifically, at the way the dry leaves around him were moving in a slow circle that had nothing to do with the wind, which had stopped about 10 minutes ago. He watched the leaves with an expression that was equal parts fascination and something that was trying very hard not to be fear and not entirely succeeding. Wednesday looked at the leaves. Then at the boy. Then at the subtle tremor in the air between his palms. "You're doing that," she said. The leaves stopped immediately. The boy's head came up so fast he nearly hit it on the tree bark behind him, and he scrambled to his feet with the practiced speed of someone accustomed to being startled. His eyes found her, green, she noted, which was unusual, and they were wide behind the cracked glasses. What? He said. The leaves. You were making them move. It was you, not the wind. She tilted her head. How long have you been able to do that? He stared at her. Several expressions crossed his face in quick succession, the impulse to deny it, the calculation of whether denial was worth the effort, and then something that looked almost like relief that she hadn't screamed or run. He said, carefully, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not true, Wednesday said. You're not a good liar. Your jaw went tight before you answered. Another pause. He looked at her with an expression that had shifted from startled to something more careful and assessing. Who are you? Wednesday Addams. I'm 8. I'm on an unwanted family outing approximately a quarter mile that direction. She pointed. You. Harry, he said. Then, after a moment, as if he was used to the name being either unremarkable or too remarkable, Harry Potter. Harry Potter, she repeated, with neither recognition nor particular interest. How did you get in here? This section of the cemetery feels like it's been warded. He blinked. Warded. Closed off. Protected. There's a boundary. She gestured at the arch of fallen stones. It collapsed, I think, fairly recently. But you're on the other side of where it was. Harry looked at the arch and then back at her with the expression of someone who was recalibrating several things at once. I climbed over the wall, he said. About an hour ago. I wanted to be somewhere quiet. And you walked through the boundary without noticing it. I didn't know there was one. That's what I said. You walked through it without noticing it. She studied the space between them, where the remnants of the ward still hung in the air like a dropped curtain. Most people can't do that. Most people would have felt a strong desire to walk in a different direction, or they simply wouldn't have seen the gate. She looked at him again. You have magic. He didn't deny it this time. He looked at her with an expression that she found interesting, not the panicked, please don't tell anyone expression she might have expected. More the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy alone for a very long time and is not sure whether to put it down because they've forgotten how. Things happen around me, he said, which was clearly as much as he was willing to commit to. I can't control it. Yet, Wednesday said. He blinked again. She noted that he blinked a great deal when surprised, which suggested he was surprised a great deal, which was interesting given that he'd seemed to stop being surprised by his own magic. Yet? You said you can't control it. I said yet. The word implies it's a matter of time and practice, not a permanent condition. She moved closer to the arch and examined the stone. Your magic brought you here through a collapsed ward. That's not random. Something in you recognized this place. Or recognized something here. She looked up at him. Were you looking for somewhere specific? No. Were you upset when you left wherever you came from? Something moved across his face at that, too quick to fully read. A bit, he said, in a tone that meant considerably more than a bit. Strong emotion accelerates it, she said. The magic. I've read about that. She straightened and gave him a direct look. I don't have magic. Not the same kind as you. But my family has, a different sort of relationship with unusual forces. I've grown up around things that don't follow the expected rules. I recognize what you are, even if you don't yet. Harry looked at her for a long moment. He had the quality of someone who listened more than they spoke and processed things in layers, which she respected. Most children talked constantly to fill silence. He let silence be what it was. Why are you telling me all this? He asked. You don't know me. I'm telling you because you looked at those moving leaves like they were a problem instead of a fact, Wednesday said. That seemed worth correcting. Something shifted in his expression then, something small and careful, like a door opening an inch to check the weather. Not a smile, exactly. More the precursor to one. A problem instead of a fact, he repeated. Yes. My aunt and uncle would agree with you, he said. That it's a problem. Wednesday looked at him steadily. The two large clothes suddenly arranged themselves into a different kind of information, alongside the careful, space-conserving way he held himself, the practiced speed with which he jumped up when startled. She catalogued it without making it a performance of sympathy, which she suspected he would find intolerable. They're wrong, she said simply. He exhaled through his nose, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, but something in the country between them. You're very certain of things, he said. For someone I've known for 3 minutes. I'm certain of most things, she agreed. It saves time. He actually did smile at that, briefly, a real one rather than the polite defensive kind, and it changed his whole face in a way that was somewhat startling, as if the real version of him had stepped out from behind the careful, contained version for just a moment. Wednesday turned back to the arch of fallen stones and crouched to examine the base of one. The magical residue was visible to her in the way residue from unusual things always was, not as light or color, but as a quality of wrongness in the texture of things. Like a seam in fabric pulled slightly sideways. The ward here had been old, set by someone who knew what they were doing, and it had fallen not from neglect but from something that had pushed through it from the inside. She reached out and touched the stone. The cold that moved through her fingers was immediate and interesting, running up her arm not painfully but with the distinct communicative quality of something alive. She heard, not with her ears but with something behind them, a sound like a single low note held and held and held, and then something connected. It was not lightning strike dramatic. It was more like two electrical circuits completing, a quiet click of current finding its path. She felt it in her sternum, in her left wrist specifically, and she pulled her hand back from the stone and looked at her wrist with genuine curiosity. There was nothing visible. But the feeling remained, a subtle warmth where there had been only her own coolness for her entire 8 years of life. What just happened? Harry asked. She looked up. He was rubbing his own left wrist with his right thumb, the cracked glasses slightly askew as he looked down at it with an expression caught between alarm and the careful neutrality he seemed to default to. Something found a path, Wednesday said. She rose from her crouch and walked through the arch of fallen stones with deliberate calm, and on the other side of it she was standing in the same space as Harry, the magic of the fallen ward washing around her like water around a stone. She held out her wrist toward him. Let me see yours. He was still for a moment. He had, she noted, a careful quality around being touched, the instinct to withdraw, but he extended his arm slowly. She turned his wrist to look at it. Nothing visible. But when her fingers were an inch from his skin, the warmth in her own wrist sharpened, and she watched Harry's eyes widen slightly as he apparently felt it too. It's a resonance, she said. Between your magic and, whatever it is I carry. My family carries. She released his arm without having actually touched it. I've read about something like this. Only once. My grandmother's library has a section that nobody bothers with because most of it is in languages that stopped being spoken before the printing press. A resonance, Harry repeated. Is that bad? Wednesday considered. The text I'm thinking of was in a language I had to translate myself and I was 7 at the time, so my vocabulary was still developing. But the impression I got was that it was neither bad nor good. It was binding. He looked at her with those careful green eyes. Binding how? I'll have to find the book again, she said. I remember where it is. It's behind the taxidermied raven on the 3rd shelf of the east room. Harry stared at her. You have a taxidermied raven in your house. We have several. But only one is in front of anything important. She looked at the ward stones again. I think you should come and look at the book. It seemed relevant when I read it and it's considerably more relevant now. Come to your house, he said. Not a question exactly. More like he was testing the words to see how they felt. Yes. I don't know you. You said that already. She turned and began walking back through the arch toward the path. You knew me considerably less 3 minutes ago and you told me about your magic. You're already making decisions about trust. You're just more comfortable with the small ones. She paused and looked back at him. Come to the picnic first. My father is reciting Poe, which he will continue to do for at least another 40 minutes. My mother won't ask you intrusive questions. My brother will be occupied with his aunts. The food is very good. He was looking at her with that layered expression again, the assessing, patient, quietly surprised look. She got the impression it was an expression he'd developed as a defense mechanism and that it was currently struggling with the fact that she presented nothing to defend against. Okay, he said. Not immediately. After a moment of genuine consideration, which she respected more than immediate agreement would have been. He uncurled from the spot by the dead apple tree and walked through the arch after her, and if he felt the same faint echo in his chest when he crossed the threshold, he didn't say so and neither did she. They walked through the old cemetery together. He moved quietly, she noticed, very quietly for a child, not the deliberate quiet she practiced but the habitual quiet of someone who'd learned that noise attracted attention, and they reached the rusted gate and the dirt path and the black walnut trees. Addams, Harry said, after a comfortable silence. That's your last name? Yes. I've never heard it. Most people have, by now. We're somewhat distinctive as a family. Distinctive how? You'll see. She said it without inflection, and when she glanced sideways she caught the very edge of a smile on his face again. He'd stopped rubbing his wrist. The path opened onto the small access road and from there they could hear her father's voice rolling through the trees, "Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door," with the full theatrical relish of a man who had never been self-conscious about a single thing in his life. Harry slowed for half a step. That's your father, he said. He's reading Poe at a picnic, Wednesday confirmed. Yes. A pause. Okay, Harry said again, in the tone of a person making peace with something, and matched her pace. They broke through the tree line into the small clearing where the Addams picnic had the relaxed, elegantly macabre quality of all Addams family social events. The blanket was black and immaculately laid. The food was excellent. Her mother had packed the small silver hamper, which meant the sandwiches were on dark bread with unusual cheese and the cold cuts were from sources that didn't bear investigation by the faint of heart. Her father sat with his back straight and his eyes closed, reciting to her mother, who was draped in a manner that somehow managed to be both languid and intensely attentive. Uncle Fester was still asleep, and the bird had been replaced by a yellow butterfly that also appeared to be reconsidering its choices. Pugsley was nowhere visible, which meant he was lying face down in the grass counting something. Her father opened his eyes mid-verse, saw Wednesday, and his entire face lit with uncomplicated delight. Then he saw Harry and his face did something more interesting. It went from delight to the particular focused warmth he reserved for unexpected guests, as if Harry were a gift that had arrived without wrapping paper, the best kind. "Ma chérie," Gomez said, "you've brought a friend." "I've brought someone who needs to eat something," Wednesday said, which was her version of the same sentence with more practical information in it. She looked at Harry. "My father, Gomez Addams. My mother, Morticia." Morticia turned from her position on the blanket with the smooth, unhurried grace that was native to her, and looked at Harry with dark eyes that were absolutely direct. She didn't perform warmth the way most adults did. She simply looked at him for a moment with genuine attention, the way a perceptive person looked at a stranger they were deciding about, and then she said, "Sit down, Harry. You look like you could use a sandwich." Harry sat. He did it with the particular careful quality Wednesday had already started cataloging, not the wariness of someone afraid of the Addams family, but the careful quality of a person unused to being offered things and unsure of the etiquette of acceptance. Gomez poured him a glass of sparkling water from the thermos and handed it over with the ceremonial generosity he brought to all hosting. "And what do you think of Poe?" he asked, with the tone of a man who considered this a genuinely important question. "I've never read him," Harry said, which was honest and which a less interesting child might have tried to disguise. Gomez looked as though Christmas had arrived early. Then we begin, he said simply, and located his book, and Harry ate a sandwich on dark bread with unusual cheese and listened to the Raven in its entirety while Morticia watched her daughter with an expression that was very quiet and very precise and utterly unreadable. Wednesday, for her part, ate her own food and watched her wrist in her peripheral vision. The warmth was still there. Different from her usual relationship with coldness, which was comfortable and familiar. This warmth didn't bother her. It felt less like an intrusion and more like company. A specific and particular company that she had not had before. She didn't have a word for it yet. She'd find the book, and the book would give her the proper vocabulary, and then she'd decide how she felt about the vocabulary. That was the sensible order of operations. Pugsley surfaced from the grass 30 feet away during Annabel Lee, glanced at Harry with the mild unconcern of a child who found most things less interesting than his current project, and returned to whatever he was doing without comment. Harry watched him go with the look of a person filing away data. "Your brother," Harry said quietly, during a pause in the recitation. "Yes. He's not curious about me. Pugsley is curious about very specific categories of things. You don't fall into any of them yet." "Yet," Harry said, using her word. "Yet," she agreed. When Gomez finished and closed his book, the afternoon had gone golden and the shadows were longer under the walnut trees. Wednesday's mother began repacking the silver hamper with her characteristic elegant efficiency, and Gomez helped with the contained, devoted attention he brought to all of Morticia's activities. Wednesday stood and looked at Harry. "Where do you live?" she asked. "Little Whinging. Surrey." She looked at him. Surrey was not in upstate New York, which meant, she ran through the geography of it quickly. "Driving?" "My aunt and uncle drove. They're at a garden show about 5 miles that direction." He pointed. "They told me to meet them at the car at 4. It was 3:27. "The address of the cemetery is posted at the main entrance," Wednesday said. "Give me something to write on." He looked at his pockets. The oversized sweater had large ones, and he produced a stub of pencil and a square of paper that had been a receipt in a previous life. She took the pencil and wrote the Addams family's address in her precise, small handwriting, then below it she wrote the title of the book she was thinking of, Unbreakable, on bonds of shadow and blood, a trib, unknown, and below that, in her most emphatic print, find the book first. She handed it back. Harry read it. "Read it again." "Umbra vinculum," he said, the Latin sitting naturally in his mouth. "Shadow bond." She looked at him with a small sharpening of interest. "You know Latin?" "Only a little. My primary school had a remedial program." He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. "Shadow bond," he repeated, more quietly, and looked at his left wrist. In the last of the golden afternoon light, there was something on his wrist that hadn't been there in the shade of the cemetery. Not a mark exactly. More like the absence of light in a very specific shape, a small, fluid shadow that moved when he tilted his wrist, as if it were cast by something that didn't exist. He looked up. Wednesday extended her own arm. Hers was identical. They looked at each other across 2 feet of picnic-cleared grass, 2 8-year-olds in the long shadow of the walnut trees, with the living marks of something old and undocumented on their wrists and the evening coming in off the hills. "How do you feel about having a sibling?" Wednesday asked. The word sat between them like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples going out and out. Harry's expression was something she watched with genuine attention. It moved through several distinct phases, first the reflexive, careful blankness, then something that was almost immediately too large to be contained by blankness, something that pressed against the careful face he'd constructed like a hand against a window. Not desperation. Not performance. Just, wanting, clean and simple and tremendous, the kind that belongs to people who have spent their entire lives telling themselves they didn't. "I don't have siblings," he said. "Neither do I," Wednesday said. "Pugsley is my brother. It's different." He almost laughed at that, she could see it arrive and be suppressed, not because it wasn't genuine but because he wasn't sure yet if it was the right time. She noted he'd need time to learn that she didn't have wrong times. Is it? He's never understood me, she said. It wasn't a complaint. It was a fact offered in the same neutral register as everything else. He tries. I don't require it, but he tries. Harry was quiet. He looked at his wrist, at the shadow mark, and back at her. How do you know the book will explain it? He asked. The resonance. How do you know it's not just something that happened? That doesn't mean anything. Because it's still happening, she said. She held his gaze. The warmth in your wrist. Is it gone? A pause. No, he said. Then it means something. She looked back toward the path where her parents were nearly finished packing. Come to the house when you can. Tell your aunt and uncle something credible. She paused. Can you do that? Lie to them? He looked at her with an expression that was dry and old for his age and said, yes. Easily. She nodded once, satisfied. Good. Don't tell them about the magic. Don't tell anyone about the wrist until you've read the book. You haven't read it. I've read it once. I was 7 and it was a rough translation. I need to read it again with more context. She turned toward her family. Wednesday, she said, and then glanced back to see his expression of mild confusion. I'm reminding you of my name. You might need it. Most people take several repetitions. I won't, Harry said. She looked at him. He was steady, his cracked glasses slightly catching the light, that careful contained face back in place but with something different behind it now, not the careful blankness of before but the deliberate calm of a person who has made a decision. She turned and walked toward her parents, and the first thing her mother said, quietly, without looking up from the hamper, was, that boy has magic. Yes, Wednesday said. Old magic, Morticia said. Strong. Not the kind that comes from study. No. Morticia secured the hamper's clasp. She looked at her daughter with those unreadable dark eyes, and Wednesday looked back, and after a moment her mother said only, tell me what you find in the book. Not be careful or I'm not sure about this or any of the things a different kind of parent might have said. Tell me what you find. As if the discovery were already decided and only the information remained uncertain. I will, Wednesday said. Her father appeared at her other side, having folded the blanket into a perfect geometric square. Splendid boy, Gomez announced warmly to no one in particular. Remarkable eyes. Has a quality about him. He tucked the blanket under his arm and looked at his daughter with the particular perceptiveness he hid behind enthusiasm. Will we be seeing him again? Yes, Wednesday said. Good. Gomez nodded with satisfaction. He needs better clothes. Also possibly a meal. Multiple meals, Wednesday said. We'll arrange it. He offered his arm to Morticia with the natural gallantry of a man who had been in love with his wife for 15 years and found this not diminishing but continuously astonishing. Come, my love. Wednesday has made a discovery. They walked back to the car, which was long and black and had started on the first try for the first time in 3 years, which Gomez said was a good omen. Wednesday sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the cemetery gate as they passed it, still hanging open at its resigned angle, the last of the afternoon light catching the iron. She looked at her wrist in her lap. The shadow moved, small and liquid, like something breathing. She placed her thumb over it lightly, feeling the warmth that had no right to be there on skin that ran cold by preference and by nature. She thought about the book behind the raven. She thought about the Latin words she'd written down, umbra vinculum, and the page she remembered, more impression than specific text, that used words like irrevocable and chosen and older than blood. She thought about Harry Potter's face when she'd used the word sibling. The car turned onto Route 9 and the cemetery disappeared behind the walnut trees, and Wednesday Addams sat in the dark of the back seat with something new and enormous and carefully unexamined sitting in her chest beside the warmth on her wrist, and she let it be there without naming it because some things needed to be read about before you decided what to do with them. She was a practical person. But she was also 8 years old, and nobody had ever looked at moving leaves and said you're doing that as though it were interesting rather than wrong. She thought she could be patient about the rest. 5 miles away, in a parking lot outside a garden show, Harry Potter sat on a low wall with a folded receipt in his pocket and a shadow on his wrist and ate a sandwich on dark bread that he'd put in his sweater pocket when no one was looking because he hadn't been able to finish it and he didn't know when the next good food was coming. He read the name Wednesday Addams twice more from memory, because he'd already memorized it, and then looked at the sky going orange above the car park and thought about the word sibling in her voice, flat and certain, like she was reporting a fact that hadn't happened yet but absolutely would. He'd lived in a house with a family his whole life and never had that word mean anything that felt true. He pressed his thumb against his wrist, feeling the shadow warmth there, and it was steady. Constant. Like a hand in the dark on the way to somewhere unfamiliar, telling you nothing except that it was still there. His aunt appeared at the garden show exit with 3 bags and an expression like a recently disturbed wasp's nest, and Harry put his thumb in his pocket, stood up, and became the boy who took up no space. But the warmth on his wrist didn't go anywhere. It stayed, constant and unimpressed by the Dursleys and everything they represented, the way a fact stays after someone tries to tell you it isn't true. Chapter 2, The book behind the raven. The Addams house was not on any map. This was not metaphorical. The street it occupied, a long, unhurried avenue of Victorian houses in a neighborhood of Connecticut that had been fashionable in 1887 and had since become something more interesting, appeared on local maps with a gap where the Addams property should have been, as if the cartographers had collectively decided that some things were better left to the imagination. The house itself was tall and angular and had the quality of a building that had opinions. Its windows were arranged in a pattern that was subtly wrong in a way that took several looks to identify. The iron fence had decorative elements that changed depending on the angle of your approach. The garden was extraordinary and wholly committed to plants that had either thorns, toxicity, a tendency toward carnivory, or all three. Wednesday led Harry through the front gate on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, 3 weeks after the cemetery. He'd written first, a letter, actual paper, addressed to the house, which she'd found interesting, because most children his age would have asked their parents to call or simply appeared. The letter was brief, factual, and completely devoid of the performative social niceties that people usually use to cushion first contacts. It said, "I can come next Tuesday. I told my aunt I have a school project with a classmate. I don't know why I'm telling you I lied to them except that it seemed like the kind of thing you'd want to know." She'd written back, "Tuesday is fine. Take the train to New Milford and I'll have someone collect you." And yes, it was the kind of thing I'd want to know. He'd arrived on the New Milford platform at 2:14 with a backpack that contained, as she later discovered, a change of clothes, 3 library books, and a very small pocket knife. Lurch had collected him, which was, she'd thought about this and decided it was the correct introduction to the house. "Start as you mean to go on." Harry had looked up at Lurch with the particular steady assessment she was starting to recognize as his default response to unusual things, said "hello," with complete composure, and gotten in the car. She'd been waiting on the front steps. He'd gotten out of the car and looked at the house for a long moment, taking in the full extent of it, the towers, the angles, the iron, the garden's aggressive personality, the gargoyle over the door that had been in the family since the 15th century and sometimes blinked. Then he'd looked at her. "Nice house," he said. She'd stood up. "Come in. The book is in the East Room." Now she led him through the entrance hall, past the armor that Gomez kept polished and occasionally challenged to duels, past the grandfather clock that was always wrong but always wrong by the same exact amount, past the portrait of Great-Aunt Sybil who had died under circumstances that the family described as dramatic and never elaborated on, and Harry moved through it all with his quiet, cataloguing calm, turning his head to look at things but not slowing down, not gasping, not performing the theatrical overwhelm that visitors occasionally staged because they thought it was expected. At one point they passed a glass case containing what was very clearly a shrunken head, and he said, without breaking stride, "Where's that from?" "Peru," Wednesday said. My father sighed. "Is it real?" "Completely." "Okay," Harry said, and kept walking. She appreciated that. The East Room was technically the library, though the Addams family used it primarily as overflow storage for anything that didn't fit anywhere else combined with the actual library function, which created an environment of productive chaos. Floor-to-ceiling shelves covered 3 walls. A 4th wall was mostly window, the glass old enough to have that slight waviness that made the garden outside look like it was underwater. There were books on the shelves and books in stacks on the floor and books on top of other books and, in one instance, a book that appeared to be reading another book, which was something Wednesday had never been able to fully explain and had decided not to attempt. She went directly to the east wall, 3rd shelf, and there was the taxidermied raven, glass-eyed, permanent, mounted on a small mahogany stand with its wings slightly extended, as if it had been frozen mid-arrival. Wednesday moved it aside and reached behind it. The book was exactly where she'd left it 4 years ago, which was not surprising because nothing in this room moved without reason. Umbra Vinculum, on Bonds of Shadow and Blood was smaller than it should have been for its subject matter, a slim volume, bound in something that wasn't quite leather and wasn't quite cloth, dark enough to absorb light rather than reflect it. The spine had no visible title. She'd found the title on the first interior page, hand-lettered in a script that was older than any she'd been formally taught. The pages smelled like cold stone and something faintly metallic. She brought it to the reading table and sat. Harry pulled the other chair around so he was beside her rather than across from her, which was practical and meant neither of them would be reading upside down. She opened it to the first page and pushed her left wrist forward onto the table between them. The shadow mark on her wrist moved. It extended itself, not dramatically, not like film magic with light shows and sound effects, but with the quiet purposefulness of a plant growing toward a window, reaching toward the book for just a moment before settling back. Harry put his wrist beside hers without being asked. Their marks were identical in shape, a small, fluid form that was almost but not quite a knot, something between a figure 8 and a tree with roots, too organic to be a geometric symbol and too deliberate to be random. Side by side on the table, they moved in the same direction at the same moment. "They're synchronized," Harry said. "Yes." He looked at the book. "Can you read the script?" "Most of it." The translator worked from 3 separate source languages and occasionally got confused between them, which makes some sections ambiguous. But the important parts were clear enough. She turned to a page she'd dog-eared 4 years ago. She did not care about not dog-earing pages. Pages existed to be read, not preserved, and found the passage she'd been thinking about for 3 weeks. She read aloud, translating as she went, her voice flat and precise. "The umbra vinculum does not form between strangers. This is the first principle and the most misunderstood one. The bond requires recognition, not the recognition of acquaintance, but the recognition of kind. 2 people who carry darkness of compatible weight and different nature, who meet at a place where the boundary between the shaped world and the unworked world has worn thin, and who in that meeting complete a circuit that was, in some essential way, already built into both of them." Harry was quiet. She turned the page. "The bond is not cast. It is not chosen in the way a choice is ordinarily made. It would be more accurate to say it is confirmed, the way a mathematical proof does not create a truth but reveals one that was already present. Once confirmed, the vinculum is permanent. It does not dissolve with distance, argument, time, or death. It is the only magical bond documented to persist beyond the death of one party into the surviving party, though the nature of this persistence is not fully understood." She paused. Harry didn't say anything. She could feel him processing, that layered, patient quality he had when information was being reorganized into a new shape. "There's more," she said. "About the marks. And about what it does. Read it." She turned several pages. The translator had gotten confused here, several sentences doubled back on themselves, but the meaning was recoverable. The marks are not decorative and not metaphorical. They are the vinculum's own record-keeping, a living notation of the bond's current state. They will change as the bond matures. In its early form, the mark indicates resonance and emotional awareness. A bond partner will experience, at the edges of their own emotional state, an impression of the other's. Not their thoughts. Not their memories. Only what could be called the weather of them, whether they are well, whether they are in danger, whether they are at rest. The weather of them, Harry repeated. He sounded like he was tasting the phrase. Yeah. That's what it is. I've been feeling it for 3 weeks. I thought it was something I was imagining. What does mine feel like from your end? Wednesday asked. It was a genuine inquiry, delivered without self-consciousness. He thought about it. Mostly cold, he said. But in a comfortable way. Like, the kind of cold when you've been inside too long and then you open a window. A pause. Sometimes curious. That's the other one. And occasionally. He seemed to search for the word, satisfied. She considered this. It was an accurate reading. Yours from mine is mostly steady, she said. Occasionally there's something sharp in it. And sometimes it goes very quiet in a way that's different from rest. Something moved through his expression at that, there and then not. She filed it away. The very quiet that was different from rest, she had a strong hypothesis about what that meant and she wasn't going to address it in the first hour of his visit because she was practical, not cruel. Keep reading, he said. She found the section on capability, which was where the translator had done the most interpretive work and therefore where she trusted it the least, but the outline was clear enough. Bound partners with magical ability will find, in moments of shared focus and shared intention, that their individual capacities are not merely added together but multiplied. This is not because the bond provides additional power from an outside source. It is because the vinculum removes the friction that exists in all solo magical workings, the resistance of one's own doubt, the drag of divided attention. Two who are bound and working in concert experience their full capacity rather than the diminished portion that reaches the surface under ordinary conditions. She closed the book. She looked at Harry. Do you understand what that means, practically? It means we're stronger together than apart, Harry said. But not just by a little. Significantly more than that. She tapped the cover. The phrase full capacity is important. Most practitioners, magical or otherwise, are operating at a fraction of what they're actually capable of, most of the time. The book is saying that friction, self-doubt, divided focus, is the primary limiter. Not raw power. And the bond removes the friction. Between us, in shared workings, yes. Harry leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she watched him think. It was an interesting thing to watch. He had the quality of someone who had always done a great deal of thinking alone and had developed a relationship with it that was neither labored nor performed. He just thought, cleanly, the way she did. The permanence, he said. The part about it persisting past death. He looked at her. That's unusual. Every other bond I've read about dissolves at death. Blood bonds, oath bonds, even the deepest promise magic. All of them break. She looked at the book. This one doesn't. The text isn't clear on the mechanism. But it's stated flatly, without caveat, which suggests whoever wrote it considered it a basic feature rather than an exceptional one. He was quiet again. Then, does it bother you? That it's permanent? That you didn't, exactly choose it? She looked at the marks on their wrists, still moving in synchrony on the table between them. She thought about the warmth she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, the first warmth that had ever sat comfortably in a body that ran cold by preference and had never once found this a problem until it had something to compare it to. No, she said. Does it bother you? He held her gaze for a moment and then shook his head once, definitely. No. Then that's settled. That's simple. Most things are simple, she said, when you remove the social pressure to find them complicated. She stood and put the book back on the shelf, replaced the raven precisely, and turned to find Harry watching her with that small, real smile that kept escaping his careful face. I'm going to show you the house. Then I want to see you do something with the magic. He blinked. Do something. You've been doing things accidentally for your entire life. I want to see it happen with intention. Even a small intention. She walked to the door. The garden is a good place for that. The plants won't mind. Won't mind the magic or won't mind if something goes wrong. Both, she said. They've survived far worse than a child learning to do things on purpose. He followed her, and she heard him pick the book up as they passed the shelf, just to look at it again, she thought, running his fingers down the spine, and then set it back carefully. He was treating the Addams house as somewhere he was allowed to touch things, which was the correct approach, and the fact that he'd found it naturally rather than needing to be told was information she was quietly pleased about. The garden in August was at its most emphatic. The hedges had grown into shapes that nobody had deliberately toppled over into, they'd just grown that way, and the flower beds along the east path were a deep, complicated riot of black and purple and the particular dark red that was almost not red at all. There was a large ornamental pond that contained something that occasionally surfaced and then thought better of it, and there was a corner near the back wall where the light never quite reached even at midday. Wednesday sat on the stone bench in the not-quite shadow corner and looked at Harry expectantly. He stood in the middle of the garden path looking at his hands, and she watched him do the same thing he'd been doing in the cemetery, not looking at them like they were a problem, this time, but with the carefully focused attention of someone trying to understand a tool by examining it. After a moment he crouched and picked up a stone from the path's edge and held it in his palm. When something happens, it usually starts with feeling something strongly, he said. And then the thing I'm looking at responds to whatever I'm feeling. He looked at the stone. Or what I need. One time my teacher was going to give me a 0 on a project I'd actually done, and the grade sheet on her desk rearranged itself. To show your grade. To show the right grade. He looked up. I wasn't even angry. I just wanted it to be right. That's intention, Wednesday said. Not emotion driving random behavior. Intention. Your magic is extremely literal. It responds to what you want to be true rather than what you're feeling. She watched him. So be literal with it. Pick something specific and small. Not what you want to feel, what you want to happen. He looked at the stone in his palm. A moment passed. The stone rose. Not dramatically. It didn't shoot upward, it didn't glow, there were no special effects. It simply lifted approximately 4 inches off his palm, very steadily, with the same ordinary matter-of-fact quality as a balloon released from a hand, as though gravity had simply been informed that the stone had other plans and had accepted this. Wednesday watched it. Harry watched it too, and on his face was an expression she was going to remember, not shock, not the slightly panicked thrill she'd seen on it in the cemetery. Something quieter and better than both of those. The expression of a person doing something they were meant to do for the first time, with full awareness that it was working. Keep it there, she said. He kept it there. The stone held, perfectly level, 4 inches above his palm, for the count of 7. Then he exhaled and it came back down. He straightened up and looked at her, and the expression was being contained but not successfully. I've never done that on purpose before, he said. I know. You should do it again. He raised an eyebrow. Again. It's a muscle. You used it once and the muscle worked. Now use it again before the memory of the feeling fades. She met his eyes steadily. You're not going to be out here doing uncontrolled weather events. This is what you're supposed to be doing. He looked at the stone in his hand, and this time it rose in 3 seconds instead of 20, and it stayed for longer before he brought it back down, and then he did it again immediately, and by the 4th time it was as easy as holding it in his palm, just in a different direction from down. She watched him work and felt a quiet, proprietary satisfaction that she recognized as not quite pride but something adjacent to it. Something that had an investment in his success that wasn't about her and wasn't about the bond, or was about the bond in the way that wanting a sibling to be good at things was about love without being identical to it. "Wednesday," said her mother's voice from the garden doorway. She turned. Morticia stood in the door in a manner that managed to fill the frame without effort, dark dress, dark hair, a single white flower somewhere that should have been incongruous and wasn't. She was looking at Harry, who had turned at the sound of her name, the stone settling back into his hand. "We're having tea," Morticia said. "Come in." It was an invitation with no give in it, which was how most Addams family invitations worked. Wednesday stood. Harry pocketed the stone, she noted that, tucked it away for later, and they followed her mother inside. Tea at the Addams house was not like tea elsewhere, primarily because the table had been set for 5 without anyone having asked Harry if he was staying, which he was, and because Gomez was already at the head of the table with the posture of a man extremely pleased with how the afternoon was going. Pugsley was across from where Wednesday sat, and he looked at Harry with slightly more interest than he'd shown at the picnic, which meant the scale had shifted from 0 to approximately 3. He was eating something green and gelatinous that was almost certainly not what it looked like. Thing appeared on the table near the silver service and waved at Harry. Harry looked at Thing, the perfectly ordinary severed-looking hand, moving independently across the tablecloth, and said, "Hello," with exactly the same composure he'd used for Lurch, and Thing appeared, if a dismembered hand could appear this way, genuinely pleased. "He likes you," Gomez announced with satisfaction. "Thing is an excellent judge of character." "Excellent. Never wrong." "He didn't like Marcus Willoughby," Wednesday said. "And we all know how that turned out," Gomez agreed darkly. "What happened to Marcus Willoughby?" Harry asked, accepting a cup of tea from Morticia's precise hands. "We prefer not to say," Gomez said cheerfully, in a tone that implied the answer would be very interesting indeed. Harry drank his tea and Wednesday watched her mother. Morticia had the careful, attending quality she deployed when she was deciding something. Her dark eyes moved between Harry and Wednesday with the patience of someone working through a proof of their own. Wednesday knew her mother well enough to know that the absence of active opposition was not the same as approval, and that approval would be withheld until Morticia had finished calculating something she hadn't named yet. "Harry," Morticia said. Her voice was low and level, as it always was, and had the quality of making the person addressed feel as though the conversation was being conducted in a smaller, more private room regardless of who else was present. "How long have you been aware of your magic?" "As long as I can remember," Harry said. "I didn't have a name for it until Wednesday." He held Morticia's gaze without flinching, which was a thing most adults couldn't do. "My aunt and uncle call it abnormality." A pause. "Do they?" Morticia said. "Yes. No heat in it. Just the fact." Morticia regarded him for another moment. "And your parents?" "Dead," Harry said. "When I was a year old." The table was quiet. Gomez set down his cup with the deliberate care of a man revising the emotional temperature of the room. Wednesday watched her mother's expression and it did something she had only seen it do a very few times. It softened, not into pity, which Morticia considered unhelpful and slightly insulting, but into something more specific and more genuine. Recognition. "We lost family too," Morticia said. "Deeply and badly. I know what it is to grow up in the shape of an absence." She offered nothing more than that, no performance of sympathy, no empty reassurances. Just the acknowledgement, clear and direct. Harry nodded once. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in the way that people only mean it when they're not used to being seen. Pugsley, who had apparently been listening more carefully than his gelatinous green food implied, said to Harry, "Do you know any explosives?" "Pugsley," Wednesday said. "It's a legitimate question." "Not at tea." Pugsley looked aggrieved but subsided. Harry, she noticed, had very nearly smiled. After tea, Gomez swept Harry off to the study to show him what he called his collection of remarkable artifacts, which meant the crossbow, the collection of unusual daggers, and the small mechanical device from 1903 that nobody had successfully identified. And Wednesday went to find the book again because there were 2 more sections she wanted to reread with the marks fresh on her wrist and 3 weeks of feeling data to calibrate against. She found the passage about bond pairs in magical conflict and read it twice slowly. The translator had been sloppy here, but the meaning was clear enough. Bound partners who were both magically capable were not simply 2 separate magical practitioners who happened to be close. They were, under the right conditions, a single working, 2 hands operating the same instrument. The text used the image of a river and a riverbed. The riverbed didn't generate water, but it shaped what the water could become. Each bond partner was sometimes the river and sometimes the riverbed, and they could trade these roles without effort because they recognized each other's necessity. She sat with that for a moment. Then she put the book under her arm and went back to the study, where she found her father demonstrating the crossbow to Harry, who had evidently asked a question about the mechanism and received a full technical lecture in response and appeared to be genuinely interested rather than politely tolerating it. The firing mechanism is Belgian, Gomez was saying. Circa 1640. The bolt patterns are my own. I've been developing a specialized configuration that accounts for, Wednesday. He beamed at her. I was just explaining the bolt patterns. I need 10 minutes with Harry, she said. Of course, of course. Gomez set the crossbow down with the care he gave all beloved objects and waved them toward the corner of the study with the deep window seat. He then pretended to be very interested in a letter on his desk while obviously listening to everything. Wednesday sat in the window seat and Harry sat across from her, and she put the book between them open to the conflict section. Read this part, she said, pointing. He read it. She watched his face and saw the specific quality of attention that was different from his ordinary attention, sharper, more forward. The kind of face he made, she was learning, when something mattered rather than just being interesting. He finished and looked up. The river and the riverbed. Yes. So in practice, he said slowly, if we were both using magic at the same time toward the same thing, it would function as one working, not 2. Unified rather than parallel. She turned to the section on the marks changing. And this suggests that as the bond matures, the synchronization increases. What we have now is the beginning state. It gets, she translated carefully from the ambiguous text, more fluent, is the word. Like learning a language until you don't have to translate anymore, you just speak it. Harry was quiet, looking at the page. We're going to Hogwarts, he said, and the sentence was constructed in the first-person plural so naturally that she thought he might not have noticed. I haven't had my letter yet, she said. You'll get one. I may not. I'm not. The Addams family's relationship with formal magical institutions is complicated. She looked at him steadily. My family has always operated outside of what the wizarding world considers its jurisdiction. We predate the current governance structures considerably. They're aware of us and largely prefer not to think about us too carefully. Harry looked at her. But you have magic. I have a different kind. What I do isn't wand work, it's not the traditional wizarding paradigm. My grandmother says the Ministry of Magic classified us decades ago as, she made a gesture that communicated bureaucratic absurdity, peripheral practitioners, voluntary non-registered. Which means they know we exist and have collectively decided that pursuing the matter would be more trouble than it's worth. That sounds like something your family arranged. She looked at him with a small, satisfied expression. My great-great-uncle had a 3-hour meeting with the Minister of Magic in 1923 and nobody has ever said exactly what was discussed. But the classification appeared in the records the following week. So if I go to Hogwarts, he started. You'll go to Hogwarts, she said. And I will arrange my own attendance. She said it with the flat certainty of someone who has not yet worked out the details but has never found this a hindrance to making statements. Harry looked at her, and she saw him decide not to ask how, which was the correct decision because she didn't know yet and would have said so. The bond, he said instead. If we're separated, the weather thing, the emotional awareness. That stays. According to the book, always. Distance doesn't affect it. And you'll know if I'm in danger. Yes. He absorbed this. Good, he said, and she understood from the way he said it that he meant it in both directions. Good that he'd know if she was in danger, and something quieter underneath that, something about the idea that even at distance, across any amount of ordinary separation, somebody would know. She closed the book. Outside the study window, the August garden was going dark around the edges, the last light catching the ornamental pond and turning it a dark gold. The something in the pond surfaced briefly and then reconsidered. From somewhere in the house came the sound of Pugsley conducting what were probably very questionable experiments, and further away, the sound of music, her mother playing something in a minor key on the instrument in the sitting room that had no formal name and could only be played by people who meant it. "You should stay tonight," Wednesday said. It was not a question but it was an offer. "I'll have Lurch call your aunt. He has a voice that precludes argument." Harry looked at her. Something moved in his expression that was so quickly covered she would have missed it on anyone else, a kind of aching want that had nowhere to go except down, compressed and stored the way children who have been told often enough that they want too much learn to compress and store things. He'd gotten very good at it. She could still see it. "Okay," he said. "And tomorrow," she said, in the same even tone, "we're going to go back to the cemetery. I want to see what else is in that warded section." The ward that collapsed, something broke it from inside. "That's not accidental." He perked up at that, the genuine interest surfacing through the careful surface. "You think there's something in there?" "I think the original ward setter put it up to keep something contained, not to keep people out." The pressure went the wrong direction. She rose from the window seat. "We'll go in the morning before it gets hot." "Wednesday," Harry said, and she paused. He was looking at the book in her hands with his careful, layered expression, and then he looked at her. "Thank you. For the cemetery. For the letter. For," he gestured briefly at the house, which encompassed everything it needed to. "All of this." She looked at him for a moment. "Don't thank me," she said. "I have entirely selfish motivations. You're the most interesting person I've met in 8 years of looking." He did laugh then, properly, the real one that changed his whole face, and this time he didn't suppress it in time and it was there in the study with both of them, warm and unguarded and very young. "Likewise," he said. She turned and went to tell Lurch to ring the Desleys before she had to think about the fact that the word likewise, delivered in that tone, had done something specific and annoying to the warmth on her wrist, which had flared in a way the book would probably categorize as deepening resonance and she categorized as an inconvenient data point. She was 8 years old and extremely self-possessed and the book was very clear that the vinculum deepened whether or not you were paying attention to it, so she was not going to pay attention to it. She was going to go tell Lurch to make a phone call and then help her mother set the guest room and then read the rest of the book sections on early-stage bond characteristics before bed, because she was a thorough person and she had work to do. Her left wrist was warm all the way through dinner and all the way through the remainder of the evening and all the way through the chapter on bond characteristics, which she read in bed with a flashlight while somewhere down the hall Harry Potter slept in the Addams guest room under a quilt that had belonged to someone who had died under circumstances best described as vigorous, and if that was fine with him, and the warmth on her wrist said it was, said he was resting, calm and steady as. She'd never felt him in 3 weeks of weather reading, then it was fine with her. She turned the last page of the section and found a passage the translator had marked with 3 asterisks, which was the translator's equivalent of "I'm not sure about this but it seemed important." The vinculum, in its earliest form, resembles a choice. In its mature form it resembles breathing, unconscious, necessary, and not thought about except in its more actions. Request aborted. Write the next chapter now. Chapter 3, The Letter and the Operative. The Hogwarts letter arrived on a Thursday. Harry knew it was coming, had known in the abstract, the way you know a storm is building when the air changes 3 days before the rain, but the specific Thursday it chose was inconvenient because he was halfway up a tree in the Addams garden trying to get a better look at what lived in the hollow of the oak near the back wall, which Wednesday had identified as either a magical creature of moderate temperament or a very unusual bird, and was arguing for the creature on the basis of the claw marks. The owl found him anyway. Owls, Harry was learning, were not inconvenienced by trees. It landed on the branch above his head with the proprietary confidence of a postal worker who has been given a specific address and considers their job complete upon arrival, and dropped the letter directly onto his face. He peeled it off his nose, read the outside: Mr. H. Potter, the Addams residence, guest room, second floor east, and felt something in his chest do a complicated rotation. He'd known. He'd known for months, since Wednesday had explained what Hogwarts was and what it meant, since she'd found the entry in the library's copy of A History of Magical Britain and read him the relevant sections in her flat, informative voice. He'd known, and he'd been steady about it, mostly. Looking at the envelope now, with the wax seal and the green ink and his own name in handwriting that was absolutely certain of him, the rotation in his chest resolved into something less complicated. Something simple. He climbed down from the tree and went inside. Wednesday was in the library, which is where she was most mornings, sitting cross-legged on the floor with 4 books open around her in a rough semicircle and a 5th in her hands. She looked up when he came in, saw the envelope, and set the book down. "Open it," she said. He sat on the floor across from her, broke the seal, and read. She watched his face instead of the letter, which he'd noticed she did. She always watched faces when information was being received, more interested in the response than the content. He finished and looked up. "September 1st, he said. "King's Cross. Platform 9 3/4. "Which is a hidden platform," she said. "Access through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. "I read about it." "Of course you did." He turned the letter over. The supply list covered the back: robes, cauldron, wand, all of it. He looked at it with the practical attention of someone mentally calculating logistics. "I need to get to Diagon Alley. The letter mentions a vault." He looked at her. "Apparently my parents left me something." "Gringotts," she said. "Goblin Bank. It will be fine. Goblins are extremely competent." He folded the letter carefully. Morticia appeared in the doorway of the library with her characteristic quality of having arrived without traveling, and looked at the envelope in his hands. "Hogwarts," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet she'd had at tea 3 weeks ago, something more settled than that, the quiet of a woman who has made a decision and is now acting from it. "Gomez will take you to Diagon Alley," she said. "He knows London well enough and he enjoys an outing." A pause, and then, with the deliberate precision she used when saying things she meant particularly, "This house is yours to come back to, Harry. Between terms, during terms if you need it. That isn't a courtesy, it's a fact." Harry looked at her. She held his gaze with that direct, unperformative quality that was the Addams family's consistent mode. They never said things for effect, Wednesday had told him once. Effect was for people who weren't sure they meant what they said. "Thank you," he said. Morticia inclined her head slightly and looked at her daughter. "And your letter?" Wednesday looked up from where she'd gone back to her book with the composure of someone who had been thinking about this for a while. "I expect it today or tomorrow," she said. Her mother looked at her. "Wednesday. Hogwarts is the right school." She turned a page. "I've reviewed every available alternative and I've already written to them." "You've written to Hogwarts?" "To the headmaster. 3 weeks ago." She kept her eyes on the page. "I explained the situation and stated my enrollment requirements." Harry looked at her. "You wrote to Dumbledore?" "I wrote a letter to the headmaster of Hogwarts outlining the vinculum, the relevant sections of the source text, and the reasons why separating bonded partners at the age of 11 would be both pedagogically unsound and, based on my reading of the bond's characteristics, potentially counterproductive to the school's own interests in having its students perform at full capacity." She finally looked up. "I was very clear." Morticia regarded her daughter for a long moment with an expression that contained, in its precise depths, several distinct emotions, including something that was almost certainly exasperation, something that was clearly pride, and something more private underneath both that she folded away before it was fully legible. "You did this without telling me," she said. "I told you I'd arrange my attendance. You said you'd arrange it. You didn't say you'd written to Dumbledore. Would you have told me not to?" A pause. "No," Morticia said. "But I would have read the letter first." "I know," Wednesday said. "Which is why I didn't show you. Your edits would have made it more elegant and less direct, and I needed it to be direct." The silence between mother and daughter had the quality of a conversation that was happening on two tracks simultaneously, the surface one and the one beneath it. Harry watched them both and understood, because he was a person who had always had to read rooms and read people, that this wasn't a fight, it was a negotiation between two people who were too similar in certain ways and had worked out most of their friction long ago but not all of it. "The headmaster's response?" Morticia said. Wednesday reached into the book she was reading, which she'd apparently been using as a folder, and produced a letter. She handed it to her mother. Morticia read it. Her expression remained precisely what it was, which told Harry it contained something significant. She handed it to Wednesday without comment and left the room, and Wednesday passed it to Harry. The letter was on heavy cream paper with the Hogwarts seal, the handwriting half print and half script in a blue-black ink that seemed to shade differently depending on the angle. "Dear Miss Addams, your letter was the most unusual piece of correspondence I have received in some years, which is a meaningful statement given my profession and my age. The research you've cited is thorough, the logic is structurally sound, and the conclusions you've drawn are, I will be honest, ones I would not have predicted from a child of 8, which I find instructive in itself. I have consulted with the relevant staff. A place at Hogwarts will be held for you, conditional on a brief assessment to determine appropriate placement. This is not a judgment of your capabilities but a practical consideration. Our curriculum has not previously accommodated a practitioner of your particular tradition, and I would like to understand what you can do before deciding how best to serve your education. I would ask one thing in return, that you allow this conversation to continue over time, with patience on both sides. I suspect we will not always agree. I suspect, further, that you would find an institution in which you always agreed with the headmaster deeply unsatisfying. The assessment will be arranged for late August. A second owl will follow with details. Yours sincerely, Albus Dumbledore P.S. The section of the Umbra Vinculum text regarding postmortem persistence is one I have thought about since encountering a reference to it in 1962. I would be interested to know where you found a complete copy. P.P.S. I notice you did not ask permission. I find I do not entirely object to this. Harry read it twice. He already knew about the bond, he said. A reference to it, Wednesday said. Not the book. He's been working from second-hand information. He's also already thinking about how to use it, Harry said. He said it without heat, the same neutral observation register he used for facts. The bit about full capacity and the school's interests. He picked up on that. Wednesday looked at him, and he saw in her face that she'd noticed the same thing. Yes. Does that bother you? She considered. No. People who are maneuvering openly are considerably preferable to people who are maneuvering while pretending they aren't. He's told us he finds this useful. That's honest. She paused. The postscript about not asking permission is him telling us he respects the approach while also gently noting that he noticed it. Flagging that he pays attention. Yes. He wants us to know he's watching. She took the letter back. Fine. I was planning to watch him too. Harry looked at her. You're not nervous about the assessment at all? No. She said it with such simple, factual certainty that there was nowhere for the observation to go. What if he decides the Addams magic, doesn't fit the curriculum? She gave him a look that was almost gentle, in the way that a doctor's calm before telling you something serious is almost gentle. Harry. What I can do doesn't need a curriculum. He sat with that for a moment. In 3 weeks at the Addams house, he'd seen things. The incident with the black roses in the garden, responding to Wednesday when she walked past them, turning without photosynthetic motivation. The afternoon Pugsley had tried to sabotage something of Wednesday's and found every surface in his room inexplicably difficult for the next 6 hours, difficult as in slightly resistant, as though the air had a texture that wasn't quite right for moving through, which Wednesday had denied having anything to do with in a tone that indicated she absolutely had something to do with it. The book that had opened itself to the right page. He'd also felt, twice in 3 weeks, the bond flare between them during moments of strong shared focus in a way that wasn't subtle. The first time they'd been in the library arguing about whether a particular section of the vinculum text was more accurately translated as chosen or confirmed, and the argument had reached a pitch where they were both absolutely certain and completely willing to defend it, and the mark on his wrist had gone from warm to hot and every candle in the room had elongated its flame by 3 inches for approximately 4 seconds. Neither of them had mentioned it at the time. They'd both looked at the candles. Then they'd both looked at each other. Then Wednesday had said confirmed with an air of finality, and Harry had said fine in a tone that meant he was not remotely done with this argument, and they'd moved on. He was done arguing. She was right, probably. Confirmed was better. The second owl from Dumbledore arrived the next afternoon, as promised, with the assessment details, last Thursday of August, at a location in London that Harry didn't recognize, and Wednesday looked up and identified as a ministry-affiliated annex. It arrived at the same time as Wednesday's official Hogwarts letter, which came not by owl but by a very small raven that landed on the windowsill of the East Room, deposited its envelope, and left without waiting for a response, which Wednesday described as appropriate. The official letter confirmed what Dumbledore's personal letter had outlined. Harry read it and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket, and didn't know why he did that until he was already doing it, keeping it, the confirmation of something that was already decided. 3 days before the assessment, Callaway Fitch arrived. He didn't arrive dramatically. He arrived in a grey car that pulled up outside the Addams house at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, and the man who got out was medium everything, medium height, medium build, neatly pressed suit in a color that was trying very hard to be both official and innocuous simultaneously. He had the quality of a person who had spent a long time in corridors and small offices, not unpleasant to look at but deeply unmemorable, and he walked up to the Addams gate with a briefcase and the particular posture of someone who was performing confidence rather than possessing it. The gate was, Wednesday had mentioned, somewhat alive to intention. People who came to the house meaning harm found it difficult to push open. People who came meaning business found it opened, but slowly, with a certain considering quality. People the house liked found it swung wide before they touched it. The gate opened for Fitch, but not widely. It opened perhaps 14 inches, which meant he had to turn sideways to come through. Wednesday watched this from the upstairs window. Harry came to stand beside her. "Ministry," she said. "Not a question." "How do you know?" "The briefcase has Ministry of Magic insignia that's been hexed invisible. You can see the outline in certain light." She tilted her head. "And the way he walked through the gate. He was checking it. He knew it was warded." Harry looked at the man now standing at the front door, straightening his jacket with a small, self-conscious gesture before raising the knocker. "What does he want?" "Us," Wednesday said. "Specifically the vinculum." She said it the way she said all things she was certain of, without drama, and went downstairs. Lurch had already answered the door by the time they reached the entrance hall, which meant Fitch was standing in the foyer looking up, a long way up, at Lurch with an expression he was trying to keep professionally neutral and not entirely succeeding at. He had a badge on his jacket lapel. When Wednesday came down the stairs he turned to look at her with an expression that reorganized itself quickly into something practiced and mild. "Miss Addams," he said. "My name is Callaway Fitch. I'm with the Department of Magical Cooperation, Ministry of Magic. I was hoping to speak with," he paused, saw Harry at Wednesday's shoulder, and absorbed this with a small recalibration behind his eyes, "with both of you, and with your parents if available." He spoke pleasantly. His voice was well managed, neither too much warmth nor too little. Wednesday stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at him with the flat, direct attention that most adults found disconcerting and that he clearly found disconcerting now, his pleasant expression holding with the slight effort of a mask that was well fitted but fitted nonetheless. "What specifically," Wednesday said, "does the Department of Magical Cooperation want with us?" "A beat. It's a routine matter, really. There have been some flagged anomalies in the magical monitoring network. A minor surge associated with this address and, we believe, with Mr. Potter." He looked at Harry with the mild professional courtesy of someone practicing neutrality. "Nothing alarming. Just a check-in." "Flagged anomalies," Harry said. He said it without inflection and waited. "Small spikes in ambient magic readings. The kind of thing that usually indicates an underage practitioner developing their abilities. Completely standard." Fitch offered the practiced mild smile again. "We like to make sure young witches and wizards have what they need." "That's kind," Wednesday said. "My mother will be down in a moment. You can wait in the sitting room." She showed him through with the unhurried, gracious manner of someone who has grown up in a house where unusual visitors were routine. The sitting room had the Addams quality of being beautiful and deeply strange simultaneously. The furniture was perfect, the walls were covered in portraits whose subjects occasionally wandered through each other's frames, the fireplace had a grate of real iron that had been in the family since before fire was fashionable. Fitch sat in the chair Wednesday gestured to and looked around with controlled eyes. Wednesday sat across from him. Harry sat beside her, and he felt, through the bond, faintly but clearly, the way you feel a current in water rather than hear it. Wednesday's attention sharpened to a point. Not alarm. Readiness. He let his own attention match hers. Morticia arrived 4 minutes later, which was 4 minutes of Fitch attempting professional small talk that neither Harry nor Wednesday assisted with, and sat with her characteristic smooth certainty in the chair nearest the fireplace. She looked at Fitch. "Mr. Fitch," she said. "Mrs. Addams. Thank you for seeing me." He opened his briefcase on his knee and produced a folder with the careful, emphasizing gesture of a person who uses props. "As I mentioned to your daughter, this is a routine matter. We've had some monitoring flags." "You mentioned the monitoring flags to my daughter," Morticia said. "I'd be interested in hearing about the Department of Magical Cooperation's less routine concerns." Fitch paused. His practiced pleasantness didn't break, he was too careful for that, but it adjusted slightly, the way a machine adjusts when the load increases. "Less routine. Mr. Fitch." Morticia's voice was even and patient and had the quality of a very still body of water, which was that it was difficult to judge the depth. "This house has been visited by representatives of the Ministry of Magic twice before. Once in 1923 and once in 1961. Both times the department in question sent someone with a briefcase and a pleasant manner. Both times the actual concern was considerably more specific than ambient monitoring." She regarded him without hostility. "I'm not obstructing you. I'm saving both of us time." Fitch looked at her for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, not his expression, not the professional mask, but a small movement in the eyes themselves, the look of a man revising his approach while keeping the original approach visible. He was smarter than he was performing, Wednesday noted. That was important. "The vinculum," he said. "Yes," Morticia said. "The Ministry's awareness of the bond is recent," Fitch said. "Within the last month. When the anomaly appeared in the monitoring data, it triggered a search of the restricted archives. The Umbra vinculum is classified as a small hesitation, and in that hesitation Wednesday heard the thing he was deciding whether to say, a theoretically documented phenomenon. We had no confirmed cases on record." "You have one now," Wednesday said. He looked at her. "Miss Addams." And now his voice had a quality that was neither the practiced pleasantness nor the more honest engagement he'd used with Morticia, something more careful, something that was deciding what she was. "You're 8 years old." "Yes," she said. And the bond is correctly documented, legally present, and the source text has been in my family's library for, she glanced at her mother. Since 1891, Morticia said. At least. The ministry's concern, Fitch said, and now he was using a different register entirely, quieter, more direct, and she liked this version considerably more than the corridor and briefcase version, is not with the bond itself. It's with what the bond represents in terms of balance. Mr. Potter is a specific kind of significant in our world. A very documented, very watched, he seemed to select words with precision, politically important young person. The vinculum changes the parameters of that significance in ways that the ministry is not yet prepared to assess. Harry looked at him. You mean I have a plan already made for me, he said, and the bond is a variable that wasn't in the plan. Fitch looked at him and something in his face did something unexpected. He wasn't surprised by the clarity of it, or rather he was surprised, but the surprise was honest, not theatrical. He actually saw Harry. Wednesday noted this, the honest surprise of a person encountering more than they expected. Yes, he said. That's accurate. What plan? Harry said. That's not something I'm at liberty to, whose plan? Harry said. A pause. The school's position is, there are structures in place for Mr. Potter's education and safety that predate this development by several years. Dumbledore's plan, Wednesday said. Fitch did not confirm this and did not deny it, and this was the confirmation. He looked at Wednesday with his honest surprise expression again, and this time there was something else in it, something that was specifically about her, not just about the situation. She categorized it and set it aside for now. My family's position, Morticia said from the fireplace, is unchanged from what it has been since 1923. We operate outside the ministry's jurisdiction by documented arrangement. Wednesday's enrollment at Hogwarts is a choice, not a compliance. And the nature of her relationships, magical and otherwise, are her own business and the business of those she's chosen to share them with. That documented arrangement, Fitch said, and something shifted in his voice, still careful, but with an edge now, the edge of a man who has been in offices long enough to know how documents can be revisited, was made under a previous administration, Mrs. Addams. The current minister has expressed interest in reviewing certain legacy classifications. The sitting room was quiet. In the fireplace, a log settled. One of the portrait subjects in the frame above the mantel, a 17th-century Addams in a ruff, had turned away from his depicted landscape and was watching Fitch with small, painted interest. Wednesday looked at Fitch carefully. She looked at the briefcase, at the folder, at the practiced pleasantness that was no longer quite present, and she looked at his hands, which were still, very deliberately still, with the controlled quality of a person managing something beneath the surface. She revised her read of him. He was not here because the ministry had sent him. He was here because he had gone to his superiors and proposed coming here, had argued for this meeting, had been the one to flag the vinculum in the monitoring data and connect it to the restricted archives and then connect both to the political situation of Harry Potter. He was here because he had made himself necessary to this situation. That was a specific kind of ambition. Not the careless kind, not the cruel kind. The desperate kind, the kind that came from a person who had spent a long time being useful in small ways and wanted, very badly, to be useful in a large one. She looked at his left hand and saw, briefly, what he'd covered with the right cuff of his jacket. A ministry identification marker, but also, older than the marker and around the same wrist, the faded residue of a tracking ward. The kind the ministry put on squibs in their first decade of documentation, when the policies were worse, to monitor for accidental magic that never came. She looked at his face. You're a squib, she said. The sitting room changed temperature. Not literally, not the way it would have if Wednesday had done something deliberate, but in the social atmospheric sense, the way a room changes when something true and unwelcome has been said aloud. Fitch was absolutely still. Then, that is not relevant to, it's the most relevant thing in the room, Wednesday said. Not unkindly. With the same factual neutrality she used for everything, but with attention in it. You've spent your career at the ministry proving your value to an institution that was designed without you in mind. You found the vinculum in the archives and you brought it forward because it was your chance to be the one who managed a significant situation. If you manage this well, you move from a useful squib to an indispensable operative. She held his gaze. I'm not criticizing the logic. I'm telling you that I understand it, because I believe people should be told when they've been understood. The silence afterward had several things in it. Harry was watching Fitch with the careful neutrality he used when he was deciding whether to trust someone, which meant he was giving it genuine consideration rather than having already decided. Fitch looked at Wednesday for a long time. The practiced pleasantness was entirely gone. What was left was something considerably more interesting, a man who was sharp and contained and had been performing a version of himself for so long in corridors and offices that being seen clearly by a child was a genuinely disorienting experience. "You're 8, he said again, but this time it sounded less like a reassertion and more like a recalibration. "I'm aware," Wednesday said. "Does that change the accuracy of anything I said?" A pause. "No," he said, and she respected the honesty of it. "Then here is what I'd like you to tell the ministry," she said. "The vinculum is documented, historical, and legal. It predates the ministry by several centuries. It is not a threat to any existing structure unless that structure attempts to interfere with it, at which point the existing structure will find itself inconvenienced in proportion to the degree of interference." She let that sit for a moment. "Harry will attend Hogwarts. I will attend Hogwarts. The bond will continue to develop as documented. None of this requires ministry management. And if the ministry disagrees?" Fitch said. He said it without aggression, with the honest curiosity of a man genuinely interested in the answer. "Then they can send someone to discuss it," Wednesday said. "Someone with the authority to make actual decisions, rather than someone who's been sent to assess whether this is worth escalating." Fitch looked at her. Then at Harry. Harry met his gaze with the steady, undemanding directness that was his natural register. "The assessment Thursday," Fitch said. "With the headmaster?" "Yes," Harry said. "I'll be there." "That's fine," Wednesday said. Fitch closed his briefcase with a click that was somehow different from when he'd opened it, less performative, more thoughtful. He stood, and the portraits in the room had mostly turned to watch by now, which he noticed and chose to regard with composure. He looked at Morticia. "Mrs. Addams." "Mr. Fitch," she said. "I should tell you, the Minister's Review of Legacy Classifications. It's real and it has real support." He said it with the quality of a man who was deciding, in real time, how much of his actual function to disclose. "The current administration is interested in consolidating oversight. Your family's autonomous status is on a list." Morticia looked at him with the unreadable patience she turned on everything. "Thank you for the courtesy of telling me." Something in his expression at that, a small, uncalculated reaction to being thanked for honesty, as though it was unusual enough to register. He looked at Wednesday once more, briefly, with the honest surprise expression that had become his most authentic one, and left. Lurch closed the door behind him. The sitting room was quiet for a moment. "He'll be back," Harry said. "Yes," Wednesday agreed. "But in a different capacity next time." She looked at the door. "He's going to decide whether to report exactly what happened here or a version of it. Which will he choose?" She considered. "The honest version. He's been in the business of managing information for a long time and he's good at it, but we just told him we'd see through any version that wasn't honest." She paused. "And he respected that. He doesn't get respect very often in the way that he wants it." Harry looked at her. "You were kind to him." "I was accurate," she said. "That's the same thing, when done right." He said it quietly, without making a performance of it, and the warmth on her wrist shifted in a way that the Bond book would have categorized under deepening resonance and that she categorized under he is occasionally insufferably perceptive and I respect it. "The assessment Thursday," she said, standing. "We should prepare." What does preparing look like? Reading. And you should practice the stone work. You've moved on to larger objects and I want you comfortable, not just capable. He nodded and followed her to the library, and on the way she passed her mother in the corridor, and her mother looked at her with those dark, direct eyes and said nothing and everything, the look of a woman who had watched her daughter handle Callaway Fitch and was filing away something she hadn't decided the full shape of yet. Wednesday went to the library. She pulled 4 books, the Vinculum, 2 supplementary texts on cooperative magical theory, and a slim ministry-published guide to Hogwarts curriculum that she'd ordered specifically, and set them on the table and went to work. The assessment was Thursday. Dumbledore would be there, presumably, and Fitch, and the question of what Wednesday Addams was and what she could do would be answered in a ministry annex in London for the first time in official recorded history. She was not nervous. She was, she decided, picking up her pencil, the correct amount of ready. Harry, across the table, raised a stone to eye level without looking at it, held it there while he read, and set it down with the easy automatic quality of a habit forming in real time. The vinculum on both their wrists moved in the same direction. Outside, the August garden went about its aggressive, thorny, committed afternoon business, and Callaway Fitch drove back toward London in his grey car and sat with the truth of everything that had happened in that sitting room and decided, somewhere on the motorway, that he was going to report it accurately, all of it, the exact words, the exact intelligence of the girl and the quiet force of the boy, and file it under his own name, and make himself indispensable not by managing the situation but by being the only person in the department who had actually understood it. Which was, Wednesday would have said, the correct decision. She'd have said it without warmth and it would have been the warmest thing he'd heard all year. Chapter 4, Hogwarts, interrupted. The Hogwarts Express left at 11. Harry had been on platform 9 3/4 for 6 minutes when he understood that nothing about this year was going to go the way the castle expected. The platform was everything the letter had suggested and more, steam and noise and the specific organized chaos of several hundred children and their families performing the annual ritual of departure, owls complaining in cages, cats expressing their opinions, a pair of twin redheads near the front of the train conducting what was clearly a field test of something that was emitting small purple sparks. The Hogwarts Express was very red and very certain of itself, and the whole platform smelled of coal smoke and something floral and the particular anxious excitement of people at beginnings. Wednesday walked through it like weather moves through a landscape, not around anything, just through, and things adjusted. She had her trunk on a trolley that Gomez had loaded with ceremonial efficiency that morning, her raven in a cage that was slightly too elegant for school transport, and the expression of someone arriving at a place they had decided to find acceptable. She wore her school robes already, which nobody else did, and they fit her precisely, which was not an accident. Gomez and Morticia had seen them off at the barrier. Gomez had embraced Harry with the uncomplicated physical warmth that was his natural register and said, in his carrying voice, "Make us proud, my boy, or make us terrified, either result is excellent," which had earned them several looks from nearby families. Morticia had kissed Wednesday's forehead and then looked at Harry and said, simply, "Look after each other," in a tone that meant she knew they would and was saying it anyway because some things needed to be said. Harry had said he would. He'd meant it in both directions. The train left on time. They found a compartment and Harry lifted both trunks onto the rack with the focused ease of someone whose magical control had improved considerably in the last 3 weeks. The stone work had given him the foundation and he built on it steadily, not dramatically but solidly, the way a person learns a language by using it rather than studying it. Wednesday sat with her knees drawn up and her raven's cage on the seat beside her and watched the platform disappear. "Last chance to find this all deeply ordinary," Harry said. "I've never found anything deeply ordinary," Wednesday said. "I wouldn't know where to start." The door slid open 30 minutes out of London and a boy with red hair and freckles looked in. The twin-testing purple sparks variety had apparently reproduced, because there was another one, and then a bushy-haired girl who took in the compartment with the assessing speed of someone running a rapid-fire social calculation, and then a boy with a round face who was holding a toad. The red-haired boy looked at Wednesday and her raven and then at Harry. "Ron Weasley," he said, in the manner of someone who considers introductions a formality to be cleared efficiently. Have you got something in that cage? A raven, Wednesday said. Is it alive? Completely. Oh. He seemed to accept this. Can I sit? Everywhere else is pretty much full. Wednesday looked at Harry. Harry shrugged, the slight shrug that meant your call, I don't mind. She moved the cage 2 inches in a gesture that was technically invitation if interpreted generously. Ron Weasley sat down, the bushy-haired girl sat beside him after introducing herself as Hermione Granger with the particular precision of someone who wants their name said correctly, and the round-faced boy came in last and said he was Neville Longbottom and immediately dropped the toad and had to retrieve it from under Wednesday's seat, which he did with an apology that was approximately 4 sentences longer than necessary. The toad is Neville's, Harry told Wednesday, because she was looking at it. I know it's a toad, she said. I was looking at the toad because toads are interesting. It's a good specimen. She looked at Neville. Where did you get it? Neville, who had clearly been bracing for the more typical reaction to his toad, blinked. My gran gave it to me. His name is Trevor. Sensible choice for a first familiar, Wednesday said. Toads have a longer relationship with magical tradition than owls. Most people don't know that. Neville looked at her with the expression of someone who has just been told their unfashionable thing is actually correct. Something in his posture changed, a slight uncurling. Really? Really? Egyptian magical texts reference them specifically. They're good for potion work. Hermione, who had been waiting with the contained energy of someone who had a great deal of information and was trying not to deploy all of it immediately, said, That's true. I read that in 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. Different source, same conclusion, Wednesday said, and Hermione looked at her with the sharp appreciation of someone who has found, unexpectedly, a person who reads. Ron was looking at Harry with the uncomplicated directness of someone who was simply curious. You're Harry Potter, he said. My brothers told me about you. Are you really? Yes, Harry said. Can I see? Harry pushed his hair off his forehead briefly. The scar was there, the lightning shape, and Ron looked at it with a kind of honest reverence that was genuine rather than performed, which made it less uncomfortable than the alternative. Wicked, he said, which was probably the best possible response. Harry Potter and Wednesday Addams on the same train, Hermione said, with the air of someone who has done research and is now matching it against reality. I've read about the Addams family. Not in the wizarding texts, she paused, seeming to calibrate how much to say. In the broader historical record, Wednesday said. Yes. Your family is very, another calibration. Distinctive, Harry offered, in the tone of someone who had used this word before. I was going to say well documented, Hermione said, with a small, precise smile. Wednesday looked at her and decided she was going to be useful. Not in a calculating way, Wednesday didn't have friends the way most people did, she had a handful of people she found worth paying attention to, and Hermione Granger had just demonstrated several things worth paying attention to. The precision of the vocabulary. The self-correction mid-sentence. The fact that she'd read broadly enough to know about the Addams family from non-wizarding sources. What do you know about the vinculum? Wednesday asked. Nothing, Hermione said, and then immediately, what is it? Shadow bond, Harry said. Old magic. We have one. Hermione looked between them. Her expression was the excellent one, the real attention, the kind that didn't perform its own interest but simply was interested. I'd like to know more about that, she said. If you're willing to explain it. Later, Wednesday said. It's a long explanation and we're arriving in approximately 4 hours. There are other things to do first. Like what? Ron said. Like eating something, Harry said, because the trolley had appeared in the corridor and he had the reliable instinct toward food of someone who had spent several formative years with not quite enough of it. He looked at Wednesday, who had money in her pocket because the Addams family had sent her with the particular approach to financial preparation that Gomez brought to everything, which was enthusiastic thoroughness. She produced a quantity of galleons and Harry went to the trolley and came back with enough food for 5, which was both generous and efficient. Ron looked at the spread with undisguised pleasure. Neville took a chocolate frog with the careful gratitude of someone trying not to look like they'd been hoping for one. Hermione accepted a licorice wand and immediately read the packaging. Harry sat back down and the compartment had the quality of something settling into a shape it was going to keep. Wednesday ate a cauldron cake and watched the countryside and thought about Dumbledore. The Thursday assessment had been interesting. The Ministry Annex was a small building in London that presented itself as a solicitor's office and smelled of old paper and deliberate calm. Inside it was larger than outside, which was standard wizarding spatial management. Dumbledore had been there with 2 other staff members Wednesday hadn't been able to identify by sight, and Fitch had been there as promised, in the same grey suit with the same briefcase and a considerably more honest expression than he'd arrived at the Addams house with. Dumbledore was taller in person than any description prepared you for. He had the white beard and the half-moon glasses and the particular aura of a man who had chosen to seem approachable very deliberately, which meant the deliberateness was visible underneath the approachability to anyone paying attention. He'd looked at Wednesday and smiled with his whole face and said, "Miss Addams. Your letter was extremely well constructed," and Wednesday had said, "Thank you." I thought about it carefully, and he'd said, "I know," in a tone that suggested he found this both accurate and slightly amusing, which she respected. The assessment had lasted 2 hours. She'd been asked to demonstrate a range of things, some of which were within standard wizarding parameters and some of which were specifically Addams territory, and she'd demonstrated them without commentary or modesty because commentary and modesty were both forms of managing other people's reactions and she didn't have the patience for it. Afterward, Dumbledore had looked at her for a long moment over his half-moon glasses with an expression that was genuinely difficult to read, not because it was closed but because it contained too many things. "You'll be sorted with the other first years," he'd said. "I want you to have the full experience." "I have no objection to the sorting," she'd said. "I'm curious about it." "You're not concerned about which house you'll be in?" "No." He'd looked at her again. "Then, no. I don't suppose you would be." And there'd been something in his voice then, not quite uncertainty, more the quality of a person standing at the edge of their own planned map and looking at the territory beyond it. She'd filed that away. It was useful. Now the Hogwarts Express moved through Scotland and the mountains appeared outside the window, going purple and serious in the failing light, and the compartment had gone through 2 more visitors, a pale, pointed-faced boy who had introduced himself as Draco Malfoy with the practiced condescension of someone doing a performance of importance, looked at Harry, extended his hand, been declined with the quiet politeness of someone who had no anger available for Malfoy but also no interest, and Wednesday had watched this exchange with mild attention and concluded that Malfoy was performing his family's opinions rather than his own, which meant the opinions were not yet fixed, which was information. He'd looked at Wednesday during his departure with an expression that was trying very hard to be dismissive and not quite achieving it. The boats across the lake were the first time the castle was visible, and Harry watched it come up out of the dark water in the lantern light with an expression she read clearly, the complicated, full feeling of someone arriving somewhere that was going to matter. She felt it through the bond as a warmth that was different from the baseline warmth, thicker and more present, and she let it be there without categorizing it. The castle was extraordinary and she had the integrity to admit it. Very large, very old, layers of magic in the stone that she could feel the way she felt weather coming, not specifically, just as a general quality of the atmosphere having intention in it. Old intention, deep intention, the accumulated weight of a very long time of people believing in this place. She would have to do a thorough survey of the magic architecture when she had time. That was going to be interesting. The great hall was loud and very tall and very lit and very full, and the ceiling was doing the stars, which she examined with genuine attention for the duration of the walk to the front of the hall, where the first years clustered in a group that had the energy of a herd of animals that had collectively agreed to be nervous. The sorting hat was on a stool. She'd read about it. She was curious anyway. It sorted alphabetically, which meant she was first. She walked to the stool without particular theater, sat down, and put the hat on, and the hat began to talk in her head in a way that was both exactly what she'd expected from the description and considerably more present than she'd expected in practice. "Well," said the hat. "This is different." "Yes," she thought back at it. "I've sorted a great many students. Most of them are quite clearly one thing or another, or they're somewhere in the middle and I have to think a bit. You are," a pause, "the quality of genuine consideration, not clearly anything, which is itself very clear." "I'm interested in what you decide," she said. "You're not worried?" "No. Most students are worried." "I'm not most students." "No," the hat said, and she felt the quality of its amusement, which was old and dry and fond in the way that very old things were sometimes fond of very new things. "You're not. Let me look at you properly." A moment during which she sat still and let it look. She could feel it moving through, not her thoughts exactly, more her shapes. The way she was put together. "Intelligence," the hat said. "Considerable. Not the acquisitive kind, the applied kind. You don't collect knowledge, you use it." "Correct." "Loyalty. Very deep and very selective. You're loyal to a very small number of things and those things are unconditional." "Also correct." "Courage, certainly. Not the brave in the face of fear kind, the I don't have fear of the relevant things kind, which is either better or worse depending on what the relevant things are. Usually better." The hat was quiet. "An ambition. Not for status. Not for power in the traditional sense. You want to understand things entirely. You want to be so thoroughly competent at everything you do that the question of whether you're capable never has to be asked." She said nothing because it was right and didn't require confirmation. "There's really only one house that fits you," the hat said. "I want you to know I don't say that very often." "Ravenclaw," said the hat, and the Ravenclaw table made a noise that started as polite applause and became something more when several of the older students got their first clear look at her and exchanged significant glances that had the quality of a house recognizing one of its own before the formality of confirmation. She walked to the Ravenclaw table and sat and watched the rest of the sorting with the patient, cataloguing attention that was her natural mode. Longbottom, Neville, Gryffindor, after a pause long enough to be notable. She marked him, the hat hadn't been certain, which meant he had genuine range. Malfoy, Draco, Slytherin, instantaneous. Consistent with expectations. Potter, Harry, the Great Hall changed quality when his name was called. She felt it before she heard it, a kind of collective intake, the whole room suddenly oriented toward the small dark-haired boy walking to the stool with exactly the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, and something about watching 400 people discover Harry Potter all at once created a very specific feeling in her chest that she identified as mine, already, before any of you, and which she acknowledged to herself as the bond doing something it had been moving toward for the last 3 months. The hat was on his head for longer than most. The hall got quieter the longer it went, and she could see from across the room that Harry was having a conversation. His expression was the listening and responding one she knew, and she wondered what the hat was finding in him and what he was saying back and whether he was arguing, which she suspected he might be. "Gryffindor," the hat said finally, and the Gryffindor table erupted with a volume that was clearly traditional but also clearly meant, and the Weasley twins were making a noise in the front that was probably some kind of family welcome, and Harry walked to the Gryffindor table with the small private smile he had when something had gone right. He looked across the hall at her. She tilted her head once. He sat down. Granger, Hermione, Gryffindor. Weasley, Ron, Gryffindor, immediate. Different houses. She'd expected this. The vinculum text was clear that the bond didn't require physical proximity to function, and she'd had 3 months to be practical about it. What she hadn't anticipated was that being practical about it and having it be fine were two slightly different things, a gap she acknowledged privately and declined to make into a problem. The feast was extraordinary. The castle kept making small bids for her attention, the magic in the stone doing something that was almost like recognition, the same way the Addams house responded to her, and she sat with the quality of it and thought that whatever enchantments had been layered into this place over 1,000 years had developed something approaching personality, which was interesting and worth investigating later. She was eating and watching the hall and building her initial topology of Hogwarts social geography, the faculty table, the house dynamics visible in seating and posture, the specific clusters of older students who had known each other long enough to have stopped managing impressions, when the woman sitting beside her said, "Are you going to eat anything other than the thing you're currently eating, or is this a deliberate choice?" She looked up. The person beside her was a fifth year with the Ravenclaw ease of someone who had been in this house long enough to have made peace with it, loose tie, ink on 2 fingers, a book set aside on the bench with the turned-down corner that said she'd been reading it since before the feast started. Dark skin, direct eyes, the particular expression of someone who asked direct questions because they found indirect ones inefficient. "Deliberate choice," Wednesday said. "I'm building a picture of the hall, and eating simultaneously requires focus allocation. I'll eat more when the picture is complete." The fifth year looked at her for a moment. "Penelope Clearwater," she said. "Fifth year. House prefect. What picture? Social topology. Who reports to whom, who influences whom, where the real authority is as distinct from the formal authority." She gestured slightly toward the faculty table. "The head of Slytherin, the one in black on the end. Professor Snape." "Yes. He's watching the Gryffindor table more carefully than any other single point in the room. He's not doing it obviously, but the return interval on his glances is approximately 40 seconds, very consistent, which means it's a practiced attention rather than a casual one." Penelope looked. "He does that every year. He and Gryffindor have a," she made a gesture that communicated extensive and complicated history. "He's specifically watching Harry Potter," Wednesday said. A pause. "How do you know?" "Because every time his gaze returns to the table it lands at the same position, not at the table generally. 40-second interval, same landing point." She finally took another bite of her food. "He also looked at me when I was sorted, and his expression was the one people have when something has interfered with a plan they'd committed to." Penelope looked at her with the intelligent attention she was coming to associate with Ravenclaw as a general characteristic. "You're Addams," she said. "Yes. The headmaster mentioned you. In general terms. To the prefects." She paused. "He said to extend the full welcome of the house." Wednesday looked up. "He said that specifically?" "Specifically." Which was notable because he doesn't usually specify. Penelope's expression was curious without being intrusive. "What does that mean?" "It means he's managing the introduction," Wednesday said. "Making sure I don't arrive to hostility or ignorance." She ate more food with the efficiency of someone clearing a task. "He's very careful." "You say that like it's concerning." "Careful people are always worth watching carefully," Wednesday said. "It's the careless ones you can predict." Penelope looked at her for another moment with the expression that was becoming her default around Wednesday, intelligent reassessment, the face of a person updating a model. "I think I'm going to find this year very interesting," she said. "Yes," Wednesday said. "I expect so." Across the hall Harry was talking to Ron Weasley with the ease of someone who had been comfortable with this person for longer than 3 hours, which was the Weasley quality. They generated warmth like a natural function, Ron specifically with the unself-conscious comfort of someone raised in a genuinely warm house and carrying it in his manner. A red-haired girl a couple of years above was watching Harry from further down the table with an expression Wednesday recognized as the beginning stages of a rather significant crush, which she noted for no particular reason and then noted that she'd noted it, which was information she didn't need to think about right now. The headmaster's address was brief and organized and contained exactly one sentence that she was fairly certain was aimed at Harry and possibly at her: "This school is yours. It will ask things of you, and I ask only that you let it." She thought, no institution gets to ask things that haven't been discussed in advance. But she said nothing, because there was a time for that conversation and it was not the first night. Ravenclaw Tower was accessed by answering a riddle, which she found elegant and appropriate. The riddle on the first night was what can run but never walks, has a mouth but never talks, has a head but never weeps, has a bed but never sleeps. The cluster of first years at the door were working through it, some offering suggestions, and Wednesday said, "A river," without breaking stride, and the knocker clicked and the door swung in. She felt rather than heard the slight recalibration of the group behind her. The dormitory was round and had the particular sky quality that the Ravenclaw Tower had throughout, windows at each compass point, the Highland dark pressing against the glass, stars visible from the bed if you angled your head. She chose the bed nearest the east window without ceremony and unpacked her trunk with the efficiency of someone who had thought about where things went before arriving, and was in bed with the vinculum book open on her knees by the time the other first-year girls were still negotiating bathroom time. She read until she heard them settle, and then a little after. She felt through the bond that Harry was awake too, somewhere below in the castle, in Gryffindor Tower, which was probably louder and redder than her current environment, and the warmth of it was steady and present, and she read another page. She hadn't planned to feel less alone in Hogwarts than in the Addams house. She'd planned to find it tolerable. She found it considerably better than tolerable, which she attributed primarily to the riddle door and Penelope Clearwater and the quality of the library she'd passed on the way to the tower and intended to investigate thoroughly in the morning. It had nothing to do with the steady warmth on her wrist. Or very little. She turned the page. The first 3 weeks of term established several things. Wednesday was the best student in her year by a margin that was not close and that she did not try to reduce. She answered questions correctly and completely and without the social awareness that makes children pull their answers back to avoid standing out. She stood out. She was entirely comfortable with this. In Transfiguration, Professor McGonagall demonstrated the match-to-needle transformation and watched the class attempt it, and watched Wednesday Addams produce a perfect needle on the first attempt, examine it, produce a second needle as a comparison, and then transfigure the second one back again to make sure she understood the mechanism in both directions. McGonagall had looked at her with an expression that was very specifically the expression of a teacher encountering a student who was going to make the class simultaneously easier and harder to manage. She said, "Well done, Miss Addams," in a precise voice and moved on. In charms, Flitwick was delighted and showed it freely. In potions, Snape was not delighted and showed it with the careful controlled quality of someone managing a strong reaction. She noticed he called on Harry frequently and critically in a way that was specific, not the random difficulty that a challenging teacher brought to all students, but the pointed attention of someone trying to establish an authority dynamic with one student in particular. After the third potions lesson she stayed behind while the others filed out. Harry stayed too, not because she'd asked him to but because, she was learning, he had the instinct to stay when she stayed, the same way she had the instinct to face in his direction when something was uncertain. Snape watched them both remain with an expression that processed several things in rapid sequence. He was not a man who was easily surprised, she thought, but the two of them staying voluntarily was doing something adjacent to surprise. "Professor," Wednesday said. "I wanted to ask about the draft of Living Death. The instructions indicate alternating clockwise and counterclockwise stirs, but the ingredient interaction suggests a continuous counterclockwise motion would create better emulsion. The alternating pattern seems to be conventional rather than chemically motivated." Snape looked at her. "You have not made the draft of Living Death, Miss Addams. It is a 6th-year potion." "I know. I read ahead." She held his gaze. "Is the alternating pattern conventional or chemical?" A pause, during which Snape appeared to be deciding between several responses. He said, finally, with the measured quality of a man who respected precise questions regardless of their origin, "Conventional." The alternating pattern was standardized in the 19th century for safety margins in classroom environments. A skilled brewer with proper temperature control can use continuous counterclockwise motion. "Thank you," she said, and turned to leave. "Miss Addams." She turned back. Snape was looking at her with the expression she'd catalogued on him, the specific careful one he reserved for things that had interfered with plans he'd committed to. "The vinculum," he said. I know what it is. She looked at him steadily. Then you know it doesn't require your opinion. Something in his expression shifted, not offense, which would have been more predictable, but the particular response of someone who has been answered rather than deflected. He looked at Harry. Harry met his gaze with the quiet directness that was his natural register, no challenge in it, no performance of anything, just the fact of his own presence. I knew your mother, Snape said, to Harry. She was exceptional. Harry was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I didn't know her. But I've been told she was. You have her eyes, Snape said, and the sentence had several layers in it that Wednesday read clearly and that Harry received with the careful, receiving attention he used for information about his parents, taking it in fully, not reacting on the surface. Her talent for finding the exact center of a problem. A pause that had something in it that was private and old. She would have liked knowing about the vinculum. She found that kind of magic, genuine old magic, outside the textbooks, more interesting than almost anything. Wednesday watched this exchange with attention and thought, he is giving Harry something. Something he has no obligation to give and some personal cost to offer. She revised her read of Snape, not upward exactly, more laterally, to a different position than he'd been in. A man whose antagonism was the surface layer over something more complicated and more genuine underneath. Thank you, Harry said. Snape inclined his head slightly and turned back to his desk, and they left the dungeon, and in the corridor Harry was quiet for a moment before he said, he's going to be very difficult to predict. Yes, Wednesday said. But he told us something true. People who do that are always more interesting than people who don't. Even if they're difficult. Especially then. The incident with Quirrell happened in October. She'd been building a picture of the defense against the dark arts professor since the second week of term, the stutter, which was performative in the specific sense that it appeared and disappeared based on whether Quirrell was paying attention to something else, and the turban, and the way he moved through the castle with the quality of a man carrying something he was trying not to think about. She'd said as much to Harry in the library, in the precise quiet that the back section of the library had during free periods, the section with the restricted adjacent shelves where most students didn't go. He's performing the stutter, she said. I know, Harry said. I noticed the first week. When he's reading his own notes it stops. They looked at each other. The warmth on her wrist had the sharpened quality it took on when they were both focused on the same problem, and she felt through it the same convergence she'd felt in the library at the Addams house during the candle incident, the sense of two attentions aligning rather than operating in parallel. Whatever's in the third-floor corridor, Wednesday said. There's something in the third-floor corridor, Harry confirmed. I went past the door. The lock is magical and it's been recently reinforced but not recently accessed. She looked at him. When did you, last Tuesday? You were in Ravenclaw Tower for the study session and I had an hour. He paused. I was going to tell you. You were going to gather more information first. Yes. He met her eyes without apology. I wanted something specific to report. She considered this and found it reasonable. What else? The three-headed dog behind the door. He said it with the flat matter-of-fact quality she'd noticed he used when describing things that would sound dramatic said differently. It was asleep. It was standing on a trapdoor. She processed this. It's a guardian. Yes. For something underneath. And Quirrell wants whatever it is. I think so. He leaned back in his chair. And I think Dumbledore knows. The third-floor corridor restriction announcement on the first night was specific, a painful death awaits. That's not a standard school notice. That's Dumbledore telling the staff there's something there without telling the students what it is. Trusting the staff to manage the information, Wednesday said. Except one of the staff is the problem. Yes. She was quiet, thinking it through. We need to know what's in the trapdoor. Not immediately, Harry said. If Quirrell hasn't accessed it, we have time. Whatever's underneath is protected enough that he can't just walk in. He looked at her. I want to know what quarrel is before we decide what to do about the thing underneath. What quarrel is, she repeated. You think the stutter isn't just a performance of nervousness. You think it's covering something structural. There's something wrong with him, Harry said. Not wrong like bad person wrong. Wrong like, the wrong number of presences in a room. He comes in and it feels like two things instead of one. She looked at him carefully. This was the most specific thing he'd said about a magical perception, not something he'd read about, not something she'd shown him, something he was sensing directly. That's a strong impression. I know. I could be wrong. You're not wrong, she said, because the bond had told her several times in Quirrell's presence that something was not right and she'd been categorizing it as her own perception rather than a shared one, which was a methodological error she was going to correct going forward. So, Harry said. 2 presences. A turban. What does that suggest to you? She thought about it for 12 seconds. Then she went to the restricted adjacent shelf and found a text on possessive magic and brought it back to the table. It took 20 minutes and 3 pages. She closed the book and looked at Harry. It's Voldemort, she said. She said it flatly, the way she said all things, without the flinch that the name produced in everyone else who lived in the wizarding world. Harry looked at her and nodded once, with the quality of a person who has been thinking the same thing and is relieved to hear it said aloud. The stone, she said. Whatever's in the trapdoor. It's something Voldemort wants and Dumbledore is protecting. The Philosopher's Stone, Harry said. There was a break-in at Gringotts before term. Vault 713. It was in the Prophet. Empty vault, no explanation of what was there. He paused. I was at Gringotts the day before the break-in. The Weasleys mentioned it. The timing is causal, Wednesday said. Dumbledore moved it. Before term started. Here. And Quirrell, Voldemort, knows it's here and can't get to it. Yet, Wednesday said, for the 3rd time in their acquaintance, but this time it pointed in a different direction. They sat with that for a moment. We tell Dumbledore? Harry said. We tell Dumbledore what we know, Wednesday said. He already knows most of it. We tell him we know, which changes the dynamic. We're no longer students who can be kept out of it for our own protection. She looked at Harry. He put the stone here and arranged protections and expected the year to resolve itself around it. We're a variable he hasn't accounted for. You like being unaccounted for, Harry observed. I like the position it provides, she said. Yes. He almost smiled. What do we do with the position? We wait for Quirrell to make a move. We'll know when he does, you'll feel the 2 presences thing resolve, the balance will shift. She looked at the bond mark on her wrist. When he moves, we move. Not before. And if Dumbledore tries to manage us out of it when we tell him? She met his eyes. Then we remind him of what the bond says about full capacity, she said, and what happens when 2 bond partners are working in concert, and we make sure he understands that managing us out of it makes the situation more dangerous, not less. Harry was quiet for a moment, and then he said, you know, most people probably just let the headmaster handle it. Most people, Wednesday said, aren't in the position we're in. Most people don't have a 1,000-year-old undocumented bond that functionally doubles their working capacity in a shared problem. She stood up. Most people also didn't come to school with Voldemort on their face. The laugh surprised them both, Harry's real one, the one that escaped sometimes, and this time it was loud enough that Madame Pants appeared around a shelf with an expression that had strong opinions about noise, and they both left the library quickly, Wednesday with the book and Harry with the laughter still on his face, and they walked to the great hall for dinner in the early November dark of the castle with the business of Quirrell and the stone settled between them and the bond warm and focused and running at what the book would have called full capacity and what Wednesday called, privately, exactly right. Callaway Fitch arrived at Hogwarts on a Friday. He came through the front gates with Dumbledore's permission and a letter from the Department of Magical Cooperation that he carried in the same briefcase and with considerably less of the practiced pleasantness he'd had in August. He had the quality now of a man who had spent 3 months being accurate about everything he'd filed in his reports and had found this approach both professionally effective and personally unfamiliar. He met them in a small office off the main corridor, Dumbledore present in his chair with the attentive patience he brought to all complex situations. Fitch opened his briefcase and produced 3 documents. The minister wants to revoke the Addams family's voluntary non-registration classification, he said, without preamble. I've been tasked with building the case. But you're telling us, Harry said. I'm telling you, Fitch agreed. Because I was also at the Addams house in August and I know what you are and I know what the vinculum is, and if I build a case against Wednesday's family's autonomous status without telling you, then I'm exactly the kind of person I've been trying not to be for the last 15 years. He looked at Wednesday. You said I should report accurately. I did. I'm still doing it. Wednesday looked at him. The man in the Addams sitting room had been managing a performance. This man had put it down. She looked at the documents. What does the case consist of? Mostly historical material. The 1923 arrangement, there's no record of what was said in that meeting, which means legally the classification has no documented basis. They're calling it a procedural error. They're retroactively erasing it, Harry said. Yes. Dumbledore had been quiet through this, watching from his chair with the attentiveness he kept behind the approachable quality when he wanted to see how things resolved without his intervention. Wednesday looked at him now. You have influence with the minister, she said. Some, he allowed. Will you use it? A pause. The pause of a man deciding how much of his own calculation to show. That depends, he said carefully, on what you're going to do about the situation in my 3rd-floor corridor. The room was quiet for a moment. There it is, Harry said, under his breath, with the quality of a person who had been waiting for the other shoe and was not particularly surprised by its arrival. Wednesday looked at Dumbledore steadily. He looked back, and she saw in his expression the thing she'd seen at the Thursday assessment, the man at the edge of his own map, looking at territory he hadn't charted, and doing so with the genuine interest of someone who had been cartographing long enough to find the unmapped places more interesting than the known ones. Full capacity, she said. Yes, he said. I believe so. Then we'll discuss terms, Wednesday said. And they did. Chapter 5, What Grows in the Dark. The terms took 40 minutes to negotiate. Wednesday did most of the talking. Harry sat beside her and occasionally said one precise sentence that moved the conversation forward in the direction she was already going, and she noted each time he did it that he'd chosen the exact sentence she'd have chosen, which was either the bond or the 3 months of knowing him, and she suspected it was both and didn't see a meaningful distinction. Dumbledore conceded 4 things. First, full disclosure of what was in the trapdoor and why it was there. Second, Fitch to be given formal standing in the investigation of the minister's revocation attempt, which gave him the institutional weight to slow the process from the inside. Third, no attempt to resolve the Quirrell situation without including them. Fourth, and this was the one Dumbledore paused longest on, a written acknowledgement, filed with both the school records and the ministry's restricted archive, that the vinculum was a legally recognized magical bond predating the ministry's jurisdictional authority, and that any attempt to interfere with it or with the parties involved constituted a violation of a centuries-old documented magical compact. Wednesday had written that last one out longhand on a piece of Hogwarts notepaper while Dumbledore watched, and pushed it across his desk, and he'd read it and looked at her over his half-moon glasses with the expression she was beginning to understand was his genuine one, not the warm approachable headmaster expression, not the careful calculating one, but the real one underneath both, which was simply an old man who had been surprised by something and found the experience, despite everything, welcome. He'd signed it. Fitch had countersigned as a witness, with the slightly stunned quality he'd carried since the moment he'd walked into the meeting and realized he was being given formal standing rather than managed out of the room. They'd left the office as the dinner bell rang through the castle, and in the corridor Harry had said, that went better than it might have, in the tone of someone who had been genuinely uncertain how it would go and was not going to pretend otherwise. "He wanted a deal," Wednesday said. "He's been watching us since September. He knows what the bond does. He would rather have us working with him than around him." "Is that what we're doing? Working with him?" "We're working on the same problem," she said. "That's not identical to working with him. We have our own terms now." They'd gone to dinner separately, different tables, different houses, the ordinary architecture of the school day that she'd stopped finding inconvenient 2 weeks into term because the bond made separation feel less like separation and more like being in two places with the same awareness. She could feel, distantly and without specific content, that Harry was eating and was satisfied and was listening to something Ron was saying with the quality of genuine amusement. She ate her dinner and listened to Penelope Clearwater discuss the theory of vanishing spells with the attentive ease of someone for whom this was genuinely interesting, and the evening was ordinary in the way that evenings could be ordinary even when the days around them weren't. 3 days later, Quirrell made his move. She felt it before she knew what it was, a sudden absence in the ambient magical atmosphere of the castle, the way you feel a sound stop rather than hear a new one, and then through the bond a sharp flare that meant Harry, something's happening, and it's happening now. She was in the Ravenclaw common room working through a charms essay, and she closed the textbook and stood up and was out the door in the time it took the other first years to notice she'd moved. She didn't run. Running in castle corridors at 10 at night was audible and conspicuous, and she had no need of either. She moved quickly, the way she moved through everything, with the unhurried speed of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She found Harry at the third-floor corridor. He was standing in front of the door, which was open, not forced, opened with magic that had left a specific residue on the frame, controlled and deliberate, and he was looking at it with the two presences quality he'd described to her in October now visible on his face, the particular attention of someone perceiving something most people couldn't. He turned when she arrived as though he'd heard her coming from the moment she left the Ravenclaw tower, which was probably accurate. "He's in there," Harry said. "I felt something shift," she said. "In the castle's magic. He went through about 4 minutes ago. He's still in the initial chamber, I can feel the dog." He paused. "The dog's awake. He'll play music," she said. The book on the stone's protections, Flammel, she'd tracked it down in October. It hadn't been difficult once she'd identified the parameters of the protection system, had given her enough to reconstruct what Dumbledore had put in place. "There's a magical instrument behind the door that plays on its own. If he has another music source he can override it." Harry looked at the door. "We go in." It wasn't a question. She said, yes, and they went in. The three-headed dog was exactly as advertised, enormous, occupying most of the initial chamber, currently in the drowsy state of something fighting the influence of music against its instincts. A small enchanted harp in the corner was playing something that was not quite sufficient, which explained why Quirrell had needed to bring his own source. The dog's 3 heads moved with the slow, heavy quality of something half asleep and half suspicious, and when they entered the chamber the nearest head turned toward them and growled, a sound that reorganized the ambient air. Wednesday looked at the harp, at the 3 heads, at the trapdoor currently blocked by an enormous front paw. Harry looked at the dog and held out one hand, very slowly, palm up, the same gesture he used in the garden with the stone, the intentional focused gesture she'd learned to recognize as him being fully present with his magic rather than incidentally near it. The dog's nearest head sniffed the air. Then it lowered toward his palm, the growl dying, and the other 2 heads followed the first with the slow, cooperative movement of a shared nervous system. "How are you doing that?" Wednesday asked. "I'm not doing anything aggressive," he said quietly. "I'm just being consistent. Animals mostly want to know you're not a threat and you're not afraid." "You're not afraid," she said. "Not of this particular thing, no." He kept his hand extended and the dog's slow, enormous attention stayed on him, and Wednesday moved to the trapdoor, moved the paw with careful, unhurried deliberateness, and opened it. Below was dark. She looked at it. The bond on her wrist was running hot, not the comfortable warmth of the baseline, not the sharp focused heat of shared working, but the specific heat of proximity to something that mattered. Something underneath this trapdoor mattered in a way she could feel through the stone walls and the dark. "Harry," she said. He came to the trapdoor, keeping his attention on the dog until the last possible moment, and looked down. Then he looked at her. "Together," she said. They dropped. The fall was short and the landing was soft, a plant, she realized as it closed around them, a devil's snare, tendrils moving with the purposeful enthusiasm of a plant that had been waiting months for exactly this application. She felt it against her arms and stayed absolutely still and said, "Don't struggle." "I know what devil's snare is," Harry said, from somewhere in the dark beside her. "Then relax." "I'm relaxed." He was, she noted. His breathing was steady, his body still, and she felt through the bond the quality of his attention, focused outward, not contracting with panic the way most people did in darkness and constriction. The plant registered their lack of struggle, and whatever instinct triggered its grip on panicking things found nothing to grip, and the tendrils loosened and they dropped through to the next chamber. The winged keys were next, hundreds of them, silver, moving through the chamber in chaotic patterns, a broomstick on the floor, the enormous locked door. Quirrell had already found the right key, she could see the still rocking lock, recently turned. She looked at the broomstick. Harry was already looking at it. "I can fly," he said, with the matter-of-fact quality he used for facts about himself, not pride, just information. "I'm good at it." She'd heard about the incident with Neville's remembrall. She'd heard about it from Neville, who had the particular tone of someone who had watched something extraordinary and was still processing whether he'd really seen what he saw. "Then fly," she said. He picked up the broomstick and mounted it and went up in one movement that had the fluid ease of something practiced until it was instinct, and she watched him move through the swarming keys with the same quality he brought to everything, not flashy, not performing it, just doing it with absolute efficiency, his attention entirely on the problem. The keys scattered and regrouped and scattered again. He moved through them like he'd been reading their pattern from below, tracking the slightly damaged one. She saw him see it, the tiny alteration of his focus, and drove through a sudden open space in the swarm and had it. He landed and unlocked the door and looked at her without the particular expression people wore when they'd done something impressive. Just the checking-in expression, the "are we moving" expression. "Moving," she said. The chess chamber took longer. She stood at the edge of it and looked at the board, life-sized, marble, the pieces with the quality of very old enchantment, the kind that had been set and then left alone long enough to develop personality. Quirrell had played through it, she could see the moved pieces, several of them smashed at the edges, the path he'd taken. "He sacrificed aggressively," she said. "He doesn't have patience." Harry was looking at the board with the quality of someone who'd played a great deal of chess under conditions where losing had real consequences, which made him good at reading a position quickly. He took the center fast and burned through the right flank. Left the left flank mostly intact. He looked at the remaining pieces blocking their own path forward. "We don't have to repeat his route." "No," she said. "And we shouldn't. The board will have adapted." Harry stepped onto the board and the pieces moved in response, turning to track him, the white queen specifically, which was the anchor of the remaining formation. He looked at Wednesday from his square. "I need a knight," he said. "And I need you at the bishop." She looked at the position. She saw what he was doing, not the standard aggressive path Quirrell had taken, but a quieter route, exploiting the gaps Quirrell had created without stepping into the queen's direct attention. "The bishop's 3 squares forward on the left." "Yes." She stepped onto the board. The pieces around them shuddered with attention, the living awareness of ancient enchanted things taking the measure of new opponents, and then settled, as if deciding something. She moved to the bishop's square. Harry moved his knight. The remaining white pieces adjusted. She understood the board the way she understood most things, not as a metaphor, not as a game, but as a system with rules, and those rules, followed precisely, had a specific outcome. She moved when the geometry required it and held when it didn't, and Harry moved with the same quality, and between them the board opened the way boards open for people who aren't fighting them but reading them, and the far door was in front of them in 11 minutes. Neither of them had taken a direct hit. The troll was already unconscious in its chamber. Quirrell's work, she noted, effective and brutal, no ceremony. They stepped past it. The fire chamber was elegant. Black flames blocking the exit, purple flames blocking the return, a table of 7 bottles, a riddle on a piece of paper. She picked it up and read it and said, in approximately 4 seconds, the second smallest bottle. Forward. She handed it to Harry. He looked at the bottle. You're certain? The riddle is a logic problem. It has one solution. She looked at him steadily. I'm certain. He drank half and handed her the remainder with the trust of someone who didn't need to verify her work because verifying her work and doing her work were the same thing to him, which was information she found more significant than almost anything that had happened in the chess chamber. She drank. The cold moved through her, not pain, just the distinct physical communication of something very precisely made doing exactly what it was made to do. The purple flames parted and she stepped back through, because the plan was Harry forward and her backward to manage anything that came from the castle side, and this was the plan they'd agreed without discussing it, the 2 hands 1 instrument quality the vinculum text had described. She went back through the chess chamber and the key chamber and the devil's snare and up through the trapdoor with the climbing competence of someone who did not require assistance, and she came out into the dog chamber and found 3 people. Dumbledore. McGonagall. Fitch. They'd come through at speed. Dumbledore's robes were still moving from the velocity of arrival, McGonagall had her wand drawn, and Fitch had the expression of a man who had been running and had not expected to be useful in a physical situation and was recalibrating his role in real time. Dumbledore looked at her with an expression that was the most unguarded she'd seen on him yet. The careful approachability was entirely gone. What was there was simply a person, older than she'd understood him to be in some essential way, looking at her with something that was not quite relief and not quite alarm but was in the territory of both. Harry, she said, before he could speak. He's through the black flames, Dumbledore said. He was already moving toward the trapdoor. I know. Quirrell has Voldemort occupying him, she said, to his back. Not metaphorically. Physically. Possessive magic, incomplete, I think the turban is covering the direct contact point. It's been degrading the host since September. Dumbledore stopped moving. He turned back to look at her with the expression of a man receiving a specific piece of information he had suspected and hoped was wrong and now knew was right. You're certain? Harry's been sensing 2 presences since September. I confirmed it in October. She held his gaze. We told you in November. You told me there was something in the corridor you were watching, he said, quietly. I told you more than that, she said. You heard the version you were prepared to act on. The silence between them had the quality of something being renegotiated, not a fight, not a recrimination, just 2 people adjusting the understanding between them to fit the actual facts. Dumbledore looked at her for a moment longer and then something in him moved, a small decisive settling. You're right, he said. It was simple, without qualification, and she respected it in exactly the way she respected all true things said plainly. Go, she said. He went through the trapdoor. McGonagall went after him. Fitch stayed. He stood in the dog chamber, the dog itself having retreated to the far end with the instinct of an animal that had assessed the room and made sensible decisions, and looked at Wednesday with the honest, recalibrated expression that was his real one. Is he going to be all right? He asked. He meant Harry. He said it without pretending he meant the general situation. She looked at the trapdoor. She felt through the bond, pressed into it the way you press a hand against a window to see through fog, and found Harry. He was hot, the bond running at a temperature that meant full engagement, and under that heat the baseline was steady. He was not afraid. He was present and working and the steadiness was genuine. Yes, she said. She said it with the same certainty she used for everything, and for the first time in the 17 years of her existence she was aware that the certainty was not only logical. It was the bond. It was 3 months of knowing someone well enough to know how they held themselves under real pressure, which was not the shaking and scared way people expected from children and not the cold and invincible way people expected from heroes, but simply, quietly, steadily, like a fact that continued being true regardless of whether you were watching it. Fitch sat down on the floor next to the enormous sleeping dog and looked at the ceiling. "I've been in the ministry for 16 years, he said. "I have never once been in a room where things were happening this quickly." "Things happen at their own speed," Wednesday said. "Most institutional environments create the illusion of control by slowing down the acknowledgement of how fast things actually move." He looked at her. "How old are you?" 11. She sat against the wall opposite him, because there was nothing else to do until the trapdoor opened and she preferred not to stand in idle readiness if there was floor available. "You filed the report accurately in August." "Yes." "And the minister's response to your accurate report was to use the information to build a revocation case against my family's classification." "Yes." He said it with the quality of a man who had filed the accurate report knowing this was a likely outcome and had done it anyway, and was not entirely comfortable with the implications of that sequence. "I believe that, transparency. With both the ministry and with you. Was the right approach." "It was," she said. "The ministry's response to it is not your failure." He looked at her again with the honest surprise expression. "You're very," he started, and then stopped. "I know," she said. "I was going to say fair." She looked at him. "I know," she said, slightly differently. They sat in silence while the dog breathed slowly and the castle held everything in its 1,000-year-old stone patience, and after several minutes that felt longer the trapdoor opened and Dumbledore came through first. His expression told her everything she needed to know before he said anything. "Harry is safe," he said. "He'll be in the hospital wing. Quirrell," a pause, "the weight of something, is gone. The stone is destroyed. Voldemort," another pause, "retreated. He's not destroyed. But he is diminished and gone." "What happened?" she said. Dumbledore looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as his real one, the old, unguarded one. "Harry touched Quirrell," he said. "Bare skin contact. The possession, the presence of Voldemort occupying a human host, couldn't sustain contact with Harry. It burned." A pause. "Your mother's protection. The magic she left in Harry when she died." He said it quietly, with the weight of someone who has understood something for a long time and still finds it remarkable. Love, in its oldest and most documented form. Completely uncontainable by dark magic. Wednesday was quiet. She felt through the bond, careful, deliberate, and found Harry. He was warm, low, the quality of someone who has been through something significant and has come out the other side and is in the earliest stage of the rest. Alive. Present. Resting. The warmth on her wrist pulsed once, deliberately, as if in response to her pressing in. She pulled back. He needed to rest. She'd feel when he was awake. "The stone," she said. "Destroyed," Dumbledore said. "Nicholas Flamel and I had discussed this possibility. He had time to put his affairs in order." A pause that had something human in it. "He and his wife chose it, ultimately. Some things should end when they're meant to." She looked at him. There was something he wasn't saying, or rather, something he had said to himself a long time ago and was saying again now in a different context. She filed it. "The minister," she said. He straightened slightly, the headmaster settling back over the older and more unguarded man. "Yes. The revocation attempt." He looked at Fitch, who had gotten to his feet and was watching the conversation with the sharp attention of a man who had considerable professional interest in the outcome. "Mr. Fitch." "Sir. Your reports on this situation have been accurate and complete." "That is noted." Dumbledore looked between them. The minister's case rests entirely on the absence of documentation of the 1923 arrangement. He turned to Wednesday. I take it the documentation exists. My great-great-uncle wasn't the kind of man who had 3-hour meetings with government officials without keeping records, Wednesday said. The documentation is in the house. Then the revocation has no legal basis, Fitch said, with the quality of someone who knows the administrative process very well and is running it in real time. If the documentation exists and predates the current ministry structure, the classification is established precedent. You'd need a full Wiesengemot review to overturn it, and that requires a formal challenge, which requires someone inside the ministry to formally initiate it, Dumbledore said. And with Mr. Fitch now holding formal standing in this investigation, he looked at Fitch with the particular look of a man who has arranged things in advance and is now revealing the arrangement, that initiation would fall to him. Fitch looked at Dumbledore. Then at Wednesday. Something moved through his face, the same thing that had moved through it in the Addams sitting room when she'd thanked him for accuracy, but larger now, clearer. I won't initiate it, Fitch said. No, Dumbledore agreed. You won't. Wednesday looked at both of them and then at the signed document in her mental inventory, the one she'd written out on Hogwarts notepaper and Dumbledore had signed and Fitch had countersigned, the one that was now filed in the restricted archive and the school records both. She thought about the river and the riverbed. She thought about the 40-minute negotiation and which of the 4 concessions had mattered most. It had been the 4th one. The document. That was the point. Dumbledore had understood this from the moment she'd started writing it out. She looked at him. He looked at her. The half-moon glasses caught the torchlight. You knew about the revocation attempt before we walked into your office, she said. I had heard the minister was considering it, he said, with the precision of a man who distinguished carefully between knowing and hearing. And you wanted the document because it changes the administrative landscape in a way that your influence with the minister doesn't, she said. Influence is personal. Documented legal precedent is institutional. You can lose influence. The precedent stays. He smiled, the real smile, not the warm approachable one, but the one that reached his eyes and meant he was genuinely pleased. Miss Addams, he said. You are going to be extraordinary. I know, she said. She said it the way she said everything, without performance, without modesty, and Dumbledore laughed, a genuine one, surprised out of him, and McGonagall in the background made the expression of a person who was not going to show that she found this as satisfying as she found it. Wednesday went to the hospital wing. She went through the castle in the early hours of the morning, 3 in the morning possibly, the specific quality of deep night Hogwarts all around her, the portraits asleep in their frames, the staircases choosing their positions in the slow, patient way they had, the torches burning lower in the absence of foot traffic. The castle felt, in this hour, more like itself than it did in daylight, older, quieter, the 1,000 years of accumulated intention in the stone settling into something that was almost like breathing. She pushed open the hospital wing door. Madame Pomfrey was at her desk and looked up with the expression of a woman who had seen stranger things than an 11-year-old arriving at 3 in the morning and was prepared to be professionally firm about visiting hours. Then she looked at Wednesday's face, which had the quality it always had, certain, direct, without appeal, and something in her professional firmness recalibrated. 5 minutes, Pomfrey said. Wednesday walked to the bed. Harry was awake. She'd known he was, she'd felt the warmth shift into the quality of waking before she'd opened the door, and by the time she came through he was already looking at the door, waiting for her. He looked tired in a way that was deeper than physical, the way people look after something has moved through them. His face had the quality of the morning after, the aftermath face, with all the careful surfaces temporarily down because he didn't have the energy to maintain them and probably, because he didn't need them here. There were no careful surfaces required. That was the specific thing the bond had been establishing since August, this particular room where surfaces were optional. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Quirrell, she said. Gone, he said. Dumbledore told me. The protection your mother left. Yes. He looked at his hands on the white blanket. I didn't know it would do that. I just touched him. I needed him to let go of the stone and I grabbed his wrist. He turned his left wrist over, the one with the bond mark. He burned. Voldemort? He was there, Harry said. He was, inside Quirrell, like you said. I felt him, separately. When Quirrell burned he left. Like, when a hand lets go of something. He looked at the ceiling. He said things. Before he left. She waited. He said the ones who love us never truly leave us, Harry said. Or something like that. He was quoting it at me, using it as a weapon, trying to, he stopped. He wanted me to know my parents were gone. That whatever protection my mother left was a trick, a fluke, not real love but just some magic she didn't understand herself. He paused. He was wrong. Yes, she said. I know he was wrong because I felt it, Harry said. When I grabbed Quirrell's wrist and the magic activated, it wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It felt, he searched for it. She waited. Present. Like someone being in the room. She didn't say anything. She looked at the bond mark on her wrist and thought about the passage she'd read the night before their first year started, the only magical bond documented to persist beyond the death of one party, and thought about the specific warmth that had found her in the cemetery in August in a place where a ward had fallen inward from something pressing from inside, and thought about all the things she'd read about and documented and categorized and all the things that didn't fit any category she had. She thought about what grew in places that didn't get light. The things that grew in the dark weren't lesser versions of the things that grew in sunlight. They were their own specific category, patient, deep-rooted, adapted to precisely the conditions they'd been given and none of the conditions they hadn't. They didn't need what they hadn't been given. They grew anyway, toward whatever was available, and what they became was entirely their own. Wednesday, Harry said. She looked at him. Thank you for the cemetery, he said. Not the plants or the dead apple tree. He gestured, briefly, at the space between them, at the marks on their wrists, at the 3 months of everything that had happened since 2 8-year-olds found a collapsed ward and recognized something in each other that neither of them could name. This. She looked at him for a moment. The after-hours hospital wing was very quiet around them, and Harry had the aftermath face on still, all the surfaces down, and she was 11 years old and had been self-possessed her entire life and was in no danger of losing that, but she was also a person, and she had been carrying the warmth on her wrist since August like a fact she hadn't needed to decide anything about yet, and she thought that this was probably the moment. Not to decide anything, just to say the accurate thing. You're the first person I've met, she said, who was exactly what they were, immediately, with no performance of it. No trying to be something different for different people. She held his gaze. I found that extremely interesting in the cemetery. I find it considerably more than interesting now. Harry looked at her. The small, real smile came, the one that changed his whole face, the one she could have recognized in a crowd of 1,000 smiles, and it was tired and genuine and entirely him. Likewise, he said, using her word again, the way he'd used it in the Addams library, and the warmth on her wrist did what it always did when he said exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, which was to flare briefly and then settle deeper, as if confirming something. Madame Pomfrey appeared at the end of the ward with the expression of someone for whom 5 minutes had conclusively elapsed. Wednesday stood. I'll see you at breakfast, she said. I know, Harry said. She walked to the door and he said, Wednesday. She paused. The vinculum text, he said. The section at the end. The one I know you read because you dog-eared the page. She turned. He was looking at her with the careful layered expression that was his real one, the one that wasn't performing anything, just looking. What about it, she said. The last passage, he said. The one the translator marked with 3 asterisks. She'd read it many times. She knew it by memory now, the way you know things you've returned to often enough, the vinculum, in its earliest form, resembles a choice. In its mature form it resembles breathing, unconscious, necessary, and not thought about except in its absence. She looked at him. He looked at her. Yes, she said. She left. The castle around her was its own company, the deep night quality of old stones, the torches, the portraits beginning to stir at the edges of wakefulness, the staircases considering their options. She walked through it with the unhurried pace she brought to everything, the east tower getting closer with each step, the wrist warm, the bond doing what it always did in the absence of emergency or urgency or external pressure of any kind. Continuing. 2 weeks later Fitch came to Hogwarts a second time, but differently. He came as himself, without the briefcase, on a Saturday afternoon when the grounds were occupied with the particular late spring leisure of a school that had survived its year. He found Wednesday in the library and Harry at the Quidditch pitch and managed to find them both at the same time, which she suspected was deliberate, because Fitch was a person who managed details with the absorbed attention of a craftsman. He had papers. "The minister's review has been formally suspended," he said, sitting across from them at the library table with the honest directness that was now his consistent register. "Pending full Wisengamot review. Which, given the documentation from the House and the precedent file, is expected to reaffirm the original classification." Wednesday set down her book. "Expected by whom?" "By me," Fitch said, in the tone of a man who had done very thorough professional work and was confident in his assessment. "I've been through every relevant statute. The 1923 arrangement is solid. Whoever your great-great-uncle met with, they left nothing loose." "He was meticulous," Wednesday said. "He was terrifying," Fitch said, with the tone of someone who'd read the historical file and was now prepared to respect the historical record. "The minister isn't happy." "No," Harry said. "But the minister isn't going to move against something with a Dumbledore signature on the precedent documentation and a Wisengamot review pending." He paused. "Not this year." "Not this year," Wednesday repeated. "Not next year either, probably," Fitch said. "The documentation creates a window. Long enough for," he paused, in the way he paused when deciding how much of his calculation to show, and Wednesday had learned that this pause meant he was deciding to show all of it, long enough for the political landscape to shift. "Which it will. These things move slowly but they do move." She looked at him. "You've decided to stay in the department?" "Yes. In a position where you can continue to slow the administrative processes that work against this kind of documentation." He met her gaze. "Yes. That's useful," she said. "I know," he said, and she heard in it the echo of her own word used back at her, and she thought he probably intended that, because Fitch was a careful and deliberate person who had decided to deploy his carefulness in a different direction than the one he'd started with and was doing it with full commitment. He left, and Harry watched him go with the thoughtful attention he brought to people he was still building a picture of. "He's going to be fine," Harry said. "He's going to be better than fine," Wednesday said. "He's going to be extremely inconvenient for several ministers of magic over the next decade, and they're not going to understand why their own department keeps slowing them down." She looked at her book. "He'll be good at it." Harry was quiet for a moment. "The vinculum documentation," he said. "The signed precedent. You were building toward that from the moment Dumbledore agreed to the meeting." "I was building toward it from the moment Fitch arrived at your house in August," she said. He looked at her. "August. When you were 8. "I was 8, not uninformed." She turned a page. The minister's classification review was a predictable response to Fitch's accurate reporting. Accurate reporting was a predictable response to the way we'd handled the initial meeting. The way we'd handled the initial meeting was a predictable result of being exactly what we are, Harry finished. She looked up. "Yes." He was looking at her with the expression that meant he found this particularly, genuinely satisfying in a way that was difficult to fully express and which he therefore didn't try to express, just let be visible, the same way he let all real things be visible rather than managing them into something more presentable. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at her book, because she was in the middle of a chapter about advanced theoretical charms and she'd been interrupted enough for one afternoon, but the warmth on her wrist was doing the thing it did when everything was running correctly, steady, deep, fully present. And she turned pages for the rest of the afternoon in the comfortable silence that they'd been building since August and that had reached, by May of their first year, the quality of something that had always been there. The way you don't notice a river until you're in a landscape without one. The end of term came with the specific velocity of things that have been earned rather than waited for, exams and common room celebrations and the final feast and the last breakfast before the train. Wednesday won Ravenclaw 342 points in a year that the Sorting Hat had never in its 1,000 years had a student contribute to a house without using a wand, which was not a record anyone had thought to track before and was therefore a record she held entirely alone. Harry won Gryffindor the Quidditch Cup, which was less unusual but no less thoroughly done. Dumbledore gave them both a look at the final feast that contained too many things to read precisely, but she understood the general shape of it. A man who had come into the year with one plan and was ending it with a different and better understanding of the territory, and who was choosing to regard this as an outcome rather than an error. She thought that was probably the most useful thing about him. He could revise. The train back to London had the quality of things returning to their beginning point while being entirely changed from when they'd started, which was the feeling of a year well used. She sat in their compartment, hers and Harry's, Ron and Hermione having established residency in it as a social reality by approximately the second week of October, and the Scottish countryside moved past the window in the early summer green that Scotland did briefly and fully before returning to its usual commitments. Ron was asleep against the window within an hour, which was his natural talent. Hermione had 4 books open, which was hers. Harry was eating the last of the train food, which was his. Wednesday had the vinculum text on her knee and wasn't reading it. She'd read it many times now, knew the shape of it, was just keeping it near the way you keep familiar things near at the end of long periods. Next year, Harry said. Next year, she agreed. It'll be different. Everything worth doing is different each time. He looked out the window. Voldemort isn't gone. No. He'll come back. Eventually. When he's found a new method. She turned a page of the text without reading it. We'll know when he's moving. The castle will know. Dumbledore will know. A pause. We'll be 2 years further along. Harry looked at his wrist. The bond mark moved with its usual liquid patience, never still, never frantic, just continuously present. He pressed his thumb over it briefly. The vinculum, he said. The part about it getting more fluent. Like learning a language. Yes. We're not even close to fluent yet, he said. In terms of what we can do with it. No, she said. We're at the very beginning. She looked at her own wrist. Which is, objectively, the most interesting place to be. He looked at her and she looked at him and the train moved south through the long light of June and the bond was warm between them and the text on her knee said, in the translator's asterisked passage that neither of them had quoted to the other but that both of them knew, the vinculum, in its earliest form, resembles a choice. In its mature form it resembles breathing, unconscious, necessary, and not thought about except in its absence. She closed the book. She looked out the window at England coming up to meet them, green and various and full of things she hadn't read yet and people she hadn't understood yet and problems that were building in corridors she hadn't walked yet, and felt the warmth on her wrist and thought about what grew in the dark. Patient things. Deep-rooted things. Things that had figured out what they needed and found it and built themselves around it without ceremony or announcement. The best kind. The kind that lasted.